Good morning and welcome to ATARC's 2022 Artificial Intelligence and Data Analytics Virtual Summit. For those of you who do not know, my name is Alyssa Cole and I'm the event manager over here at ATARC, and I'll be emceeing today's summit. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center. ATARC is a nonprofit that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. We provide ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. Thank you to our partners over at Alation and Pure Storage for helping us to create today's summit. Both truly great partners to us here at ATARC. Additionally, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoy this great and informative day. I'd also like to remind you that after each panel, there will be a time for Q&A. Please place all questions you have in the Q&A box on your screen. Also, during the panels, there will be a time for poll questions. If you'd like to be eligible for CPEs, don't forget to answer those. Up first, I'd like to introduce our visionary keynote, Neil Chaudhry. Neil is the director for the Federal AI Implementations in the IT Modernization Centers for Excellence within the Technology Transformation Services within GSA. Neil, take it away.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I would really like to thank the ATARC team for putting together such a great event on really fostering positive data cultures in organizations that promote the delivery of equitable AI. I would like to begin my comments today by talking about the mission of the Centers of Excellence housed within GSA. So the Centers of Excellence are a really important part of the federal IT modernization effort. The Office of American Innovation originally established the GSA Centers of Excellence to accelerate IT modernization across government. And now, as part of GSA's technology transformation services, the Centers of Excellence, which are now codified in law, accelerate IT modernization at federal agencies by leveraging private sector innovation and government services, while really centralizing some of those best practices and expertise that allow for holistic transformation. So really our business model at the Centers of Excellence is to leverage commercially available solutions and expertise from industry to deliver enterprise transformation in partnership with agencies. So, it's a very different way we think about it, where, we think of industry really and academia also as our partners with the agencies in order to further a common interest. I've been with the COEs for about 2 years now, a little over 2 years. And during my time here at the COEs, I've worked with numerous agencies across multiple departments, and I have some general themes that I would like to share with you, specifically or more tailored to, what I see from my role as one of the leads in the AI Center of Excellence. So really what I would like to talk about is some of the enduring qualities of organizations that have the capacity or are working towards the capacity to, really absorb innovation in the advanced data and AI space. So one of the first things that I've noted is that they really segment their workforce, and not segmenting in terms of position descriptions or job series, but in segmentation as the type of user, and they typically use a 80-15-5 model. So for in the data and analytics space, really what that means is 80% of their workforce can do what they need to do in terms of data and analytics using tools such as Excel. There are another 15% that really end up leveraging low-code, no-code commercial software, visualization software that's already has a really good ecosystems around it, easy to implement, they're easy to train. And the last 5% are their really superpower users, the 5% that really need those custom tools and environments in order to practice the craft of data science. So it's not a one size fits all. That's a really good thing that I've observed in some of the organizations that are making data science work and data and analytics work well. The next thing is that these organizations are user-centric. So by that, what I mean is they let the users work to prioritize those IT controls they need to do their job, not the other way around, where IT isn't turning off or functionality on commercially available software because it's convenient for IT. It's IT's working with the users to figure out what controls they need in order to do their job with that application that they're working with. Next thing is that these organizations value experimentation, not just for the sake of experimentation, but they set up the environments where you don't need special permission in order to innovate. You can experiment, you can share, and you get rewarded for that innovative behavior. In terms of not just monetary recognition, but recognition of, among your peers in your agency. Next thing is they really foster data-driven cultures where, the governance of government missions is really not about a paperwork-driven operation. It's a mission-driven operation. Another thing is that they really consider the risk and reward of innovation. So, at the strategic level, trying to understand and balance the cost of failure by not doing something against the cost of failing. So, that's something that they really, this is something that I've observed that is one of the most crucial elements. And the last bit, which is where I started off the conversation with partnerships with industry, where these organizations, they create co-petition environments, not competition environments, in their organization, where the teams are not competing with industry, but they're learning from industry and they're challenging themselves to do better and incorporate industry best practices. And the final thing is really this idea of what I'm doing right now today, is this idea of multimodal learning and engagement with industry. So participation in forums such as these, attending trade conferences, listening, scheduling time to meet with vendors to understand their different capabilities. So all those things together are really what end up driving, innovation in the data and artificial intelligence and the emerging technology space. So, pivoting from that is really, in my experience, I work with 3 stakeholder communities primarily who influence application development within the federal government. The first is, the first set of stakeholders obviously is, the agency leadership. And some of the things that, I've seen that have worked really well in, working with data, using, using data as leveraging data as a strategic asset, monetizing, your data, implementing AI at scale. For leadership, it all starts with having an end state in mind that really boils down to knowing when to stop. So you say, this is what I want to achieve in very granular terms, and say, once I get there is when I'm going to move to a next phase. So it's not, so it's very discrete. You already know exactly that in 2-3 years, this is exactly where you want to end up. So you can have really good metrics for success. So, in terms of AI, it's a little trickier because you really, to have successful AI project to scale, it's about setting the vision in the organization that yes, we're going to use AI. No, it's not going to replace the workforce. Yes, it's going to augment what you do so that you're not doing ministerial tasks. You are focused on cognitive tasks. So setting that vision and then that strategic roadmap that really lays out the groundwork that this is how the workforce is doing work today as a result of implementing AI tools. This is what my workforce will do next in a very phased approach. So, for example, you say, hey, today my workforce spends 20% of their time printing out forms and retyping them. As a result of AI tools, what will they do with that 20% of their time that they're now doing ministerial tasks with? So having those discrete understanding of what you want to accomplish. And the next thing is really about executive sponsors for this operational roadmap, plotting where you want to go. And typically, these champions work best when they're not technologists. The next set of constituents I really work with are frontline staff. And this is where, these are the folks that, I work with, they generate their use cases and then their prototypes to show value. And the way they succeed is they share horizontally across the organization, and what they do is that really helps integration and ops because it really drives up demand signals. Now, the third community, which a lot of times, doesn't really get the respect that they need, but those are the critical stakeholders in making sure everything works, is what I call the middle management. These are the folks that have the institutional knowledge and access to the managed program support to bridge strategy and implementation and create these pathways to production at scale. So these are the folks that, manage the processes, manage the infrastructure, manage the environments where AI happens, the innovation happens, not just for the sake of innovation, but really to focus this idea back on cognitive aspects of the job, things that humans are good at. So that being said, where, I've seen technology mature and where our partners are maturing and, where industry is going. And the three areas that they're really going in are, our industry partners in the marketplace are really creating these wonderful AI-enabled tools that are designed with broader user bases in mind. These extensible low-code, no-code platform, the GUI, the GUI-driven commercial tools, the data labeling platforms, the ability to mix and match different things and be able to do some modeling at your desk. That maturation of open source commercial offerings in the data science space is really wonderful to see. The next big trend that I'm seeing that agencies are really starting to adopt is geospatially and temporally aware agent-based modeling tools. So, that being able to use a combination of open source and commercially available geospatial ecosystems to take on more of that AI modeling capability on that what if, on which way things are going to go, which way trends are going to go, whether it's a forest fire, whether it's an infectious disease. Those are some things, with geospatial and temporally based tools, I'm seeing a lot of advances in this space. And the last thing, is this intelligent automation, the chatbots, computer vision, text analytics, these tools that really perform discrete tasks that are part of larger cognitive workflows. And these intelligent automation tools are what are really augmenting the workforce and helping agencies optimize and expedite really large work processes, and help people focus on decision making, on the cognitive decision making, and basically also enabling humans in the loop or on the loop to sort of steer and tune the systems. So, I've talked a lot today, and really in conclusion, what I would like to say is that as technology advances and matures, there are many impacts, some good, some bad, but there are many that are unintended. And understanding unintended consequences is very crucial in the field of AI, where trust in the AI is really the keystone to maintaining democratic societies and personal freedoms. So for AI to work for the American people, it needs to be at its core inclusive. And what I mean by that is we really need to be able to focus on enabling updated laws and policies to limit the disparate impact of technology on marginalized communities, and those without access to reliable broadband. And something I've been thinking about more recently is really the elderly, many of them who have not been able to effectively adapt to the digital age. So as we're using these AI tools and data and analytics, what are we really doing to be more inclusive for a lot of the elderly folks in Americans? And the last thing I would like to say is AI also needs to be equitable. So what that means is in a broader sense is that the applications need to be transparent, explainable, auditable, and most importantly, governable to meet the community norms of the communities you're in. So with those thoughts, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to hear from me today. And I'm really excited about the rest of the speakers in the lineup today. It's a lot of these folks I've known for a while, and really excited to be a part and listen in on the rest of the program. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you so much for that great keynote, Neil. It was incredible insight. Up next, we're going to be hearing from an emerging technology talk from Aaron Kalb. Aaron is the Chief Data and Analytics Officer over at Elation. Aaron, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks, Neil, for that great keynote. Let me share my screen. Is that working?
Yep.
Okay, so you see it full screen? Good. So in this talk, talking about fostering data culture, and I ended with the idea of talking about the impact of technology and being, thoughtful about that. So I think it's a great segue to what I'd like to talk about today. I'm going to start by quickly talking about what data culture is and then how we get data culture. But in each case, I'll start a little more philosophical or broad, and then we'll sort of zoom in together. So let's start quickly just by defining what is culture. If I say culture, think what comes to mind. For many people, it's these sort of colorful clothing from all around the world, National Geographic covers, or the more drab Silicon Valley uniform. Maybe some of you are in academic or government agencies that have a similar sort of everyone wearing the same thing vibe going on. But really, culture goes beyond clothes. It's everything people do together as social animals, including their values and beliefs, and ultimately their behaviors. So organizational culture, some people call this corporate culture, but of course we on this call know that not everyone's at a corporation. You could be an academic institution, government agency, a military, you name it. But in organizations, cultures develop, norms develop, behaviors and values and beliefs that are common, just like they can happen in societies or countries. And there's a lot of research showing that at the end of the day, organizational culture has a huge impact on how decisions are made. Maybe you've seen this famous quote about how culture eats strategy for breakfast. So in that context, what is a data culture specifically? McKinsey has this kind of very terse, memorable definition, which is that data culture is decision culture. But I think to make this a little bit more clear, it's best to contrast data culture, what we're advocating for, to other kinds of corporate cultures that can happen. like a consensus culture. I'm going to go through two kind of foils, if you will, to data culture. As I talk about each of these three, let us think in your head, like, is my culture in my organization, do I see any of that culture on the slides here? So consensus culture feels a little bit like being in preschool, holding hands with your friends, because the thing that's valued most of all in a consensus culture is agreement and harmony. And it can feel really good because in this sort of culture, no one gets overruled or overridden, no one gets excluded, no one gets ignored. Really, there's a lot of work put into making sure everyone feels like they're part of the process and they're happy with the outcome. But as a result of that, people in a consensus culture will ultimately decide to do whatever is the least controversial idea, because anything, it's really out there, someone's going to veto it. And as a result, they tend to move very slowly because it takes a while to build consensus. And it's hard to innovate because most really new ideas are scary to at least, somebody in the room. So that's consensus culture. There's pros and cons for sure. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum is a hierarchical culture. This is shown as a hippo here for a couple of reasons. One is this fun acronym, the highest paid person's opinion, hippo. And again, in a hierarchical culture, there's something that's valued in terms of status. It could be tenure at the organization. It could be, the 4-star general or the executive vice president. That's the person who kind of gets to make all the decisions. And if an idea comes from, the quote unquote lowly intern or somebody who isn't, high up enough, that idea, they might not even feel comfortable voicing that idea. If they do, it might be ignored. Maybe somebody tries to bring data to support their idea, but in the end, it's up to the, top brass. And that can ultimately, stifle creativity and be demoralizing and can cause mistakes to be made because sometimes that highest paid person is wrong. Now, again, there are places for all of these cultures. Nonprofits often like the vibe of consensus culture. If you're trying to make, decisions in a military context, you might need a lot of hierarchy to get that speed. But we would argue that in many organizations today, data culture can be a really good alternative to both of these and many others, because in a data culture, we value evidence and reason above all else. And so as a result, we do what the right thing is. And I don't mean that in some deep moral sense, though obviously ethics should play a huge role, as mentioned earlier, but it's that you look at all the evidence and you see where it points. And so it doesn't matter whether it was, the executive vice president or the lowly intern who makes the suggestion, every idea is weighed on its merits based on the data, and then you do the right thing. And as a result, you wind up winning. And it's a big statement, but there's a ton of research backing it up. Don't take my word for it. You can check with any of the industry analysts, Forrester, Gartner, McKinsey. Alation also sponsors some independent research that we publish quarterly called the State of Data Culture report, where you can see, in any of these places, a lot of the evidence of how data culture can have a huge impact on performance in organizations. So if we know what it is and we know that we want it, how do we get data culture? And I think the place we ought to start is to understand how we change culture in general, and what are the things that influence human behavior. And obviously, many people in many different fields have written extensively about this. An economist might say incentives change behavior. Somebody in social science or in the education field might say, oh, training education changes behavior. Could technology possibly change behavior? Is that just Silicon Valley hubris and grandiosity? Well, I'll let you decide, but spoiler alert, I strongly believe that yes, technology can change culture. Not only can it change culture, I'd say that it actually is the most efficient and powerful mechanism for getting human behavior to change individually and collectively, which of course, ultimately is cultural change. So it's a big statement. Let me see if I can prove it to you. Let's start by soaking up this set of images of pictures of food and of people that I think lead me to this seemingly very obvious observation that our modern culture now is uniquely characterized by oversharing and self-promotion, which is any period in history. And from that obvious observation, it could be easy to jump to this seemingly logical conclusion that people today must just be uniquely prone to oversharing and self-promotion. Look how much of it is happening. Well, let's dive a little deeper. So here's the over 250 million with a B pictures of what people are going to eat for breakfast or lunch. Look at this juicy hamburger over here. And you could say, who cares? Why are we doing this? What is wrong with people today? Well, you could level the same criticism potentially at esteemed painter Cezanne. Here's a picture he didn't take, he made, of what he was about to eat for breakfast. While culture is eating strategy for breakfast, Cezanne is eating this in English plate of peaches, or in modern parlance, maybe he'd title it this way, but it's not an entirely new idea. And if we in fact go back way further, 15,000 years ago, staying in France, to Lascaux, and go into this famous cave there, we'll see these pictures of what these cavemen and women were about to eat for their lunch, which is a juicy hamburger. A little bit farther up the supply chain, these ancient cows called oryx being depicted here. So again, kind of old impulse here of depicting food. And same thing for selfies. Before there were a billion selfies on Instagram, Leo da Vinci, a huge role model for me, did this self-portrait in his notebook, which I think is really quite impressive. 500 years ago, and again 15,000 years ago, same cave, different part. People were doing basically the prehistoric version of a selfie, putting their hand on a wall, blowing some pigment, doing the Neolithic version of this famous selfie at the Oscars. So people have always wanted to say we are here. Human nature doesn't change, so human nature didn't change. Human culture changed, and we didn't get more self-absorbed. It just got easier for us to self-promote, right? If you're Da Vinci, it takes decades of training and then thousands of marks on a paper to make this selfie, whereas this selfie you can make in a couple minutes. You have a phone in your pocket, it has automatic filters, you can click to publish. It's just that easy. So the thing that really drove this change to the culture, this mass change to behavior, at the end of the day, is technology, right? Going all the way back to the wheel, which reduced friction to make it easier to move things. Technology makes things easier, and then people do those things more. Because at the end of the day, how does human behavior work? Do we do the right thing? Obviously not. Look around. Do we do what we want to do? You'd think people would do what they want to do, but we don't. I wanted to clean my closet after work yesterday. Instead, I played a stupid game after work. Because at the end of the day, people do what's easy, and technology plays a huge role in determining what that is. So we as technologists have a huge responsibility. I think it's a mistake to say that tech is good simply because it makes it easier for people to do what they want to do, because sometimes the people want to do is not what's good for them necessarily. I think tech for good should make it easier for people to do the right thing, and I'll show an example of that has to do with government regulation and safety, and still getting what you want. Ideally, we do both of these at once, but certainly we should do the second. So let's start with Exhibit A of what happens when technology makes it too easy to do a thing people mostly shouldn't do. Boom! Look at this incredible 3D pie chart. Any of you on the call who know anything about data visualization can point out 100 reasons why this is not the best way to show information mostly, except maybe in this context. And yet, because it's one click to do it, people will do it, and it's a mistake. So let's burn that up. And another quick example is I'm working in Apple Keynote here, which makes it really easy to make flames and explosions and whatever. I probably shouldn't do that. It's a little bit garish and obnoxious, but it's one click, so I do it. I would never animate it cell by cell like the first Disney movies were made. So moving to a much more serious and consequential example in the data space, I'll contend that technology has often made it easier to tell lies with data than to uncover the truth in data. So if that happened too fast, take a look over here. Here we see the actual data. This is a contrived example, but this kind of thing happens all the time in corporations, and I would imagine in government agencies as well, sadly. Here what's happening is this revenue is effectively flat. All the changes are happening, orders of magnitude past the point of significance. And so if I set, the min on the y-axis to 0 and plot this the way you would expect, it's clear that this is flat. And of course, inflation adjusted, we're actually losing money. I should be fired if I'm responsible for this revenue stream. But of course, I can just type a little thing here and check a box, turn this into an apparently exponential curve. There's no indication really to the viewer of what I did. If I share the chart, but not the underlying data, I might get promoted when I ought to be fired. And that is really a problem. There's 100 versions of this. And that's why data literacy is so important. People are worried about being misled by data in part. So ideally, what we'll do with technology is we'll simultaneously do good tech that makes it easier for people to get where they want to go, like this GPS device telling me in 4.1 miles, turn right so I can get to my destination. And at the same time, we'll do tech for good. We'll make it easier for people to go where they're going in the right way, right? So someone in the government set the speed limit based on where there's schools, blah, 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 and they can help me get there. So to wrap up, how does technology then foster data culture specifically? Well, let's go back to human behavior, but looking specifically at our colleagues and coworkers. Are they making decisions without data because they're evil? Probably not. Are they doing it because they don't care? Probably not that. It's probably because getting data is really hard, takes a long time, because data isn't clear, isn't always correct, isn't understandable in context, and maybe they're scared of misinterpreting or being misled. And these are actually really logical reasons for not using data. But as a result of not using data, you may then make an illogical decision. So if that's what's happening today, people are making decisions with that data for these reasons. What we have to do with technology is take all these really hard things and make them so easy that people do it, and make the right things easy to do as the wrong thing. And the way we can do this, making it easy to find, easy to understand, easy to trust, I would contend is with technology. So in closing, we at Elation, full disclosure, make a data intelligence platform. We're not the only ones by any means. We think we're the best. But what a data intelligence platform will give you is three things: search and discovery, like a Google search, basically, for all the data in or outside of your organization that could be relevant. Data literacy aids to help you sort of interpret and understand data correctly, and data governance, so you can trust that a given data set is accurate and appropriate to use. And when you have these three elements, thinking of that last one as kind of like spell check for data, when you have all these things in place, you can actually get a data culture in your organization, which, as we discussed in the beginning, can lead to success. So this is a model for how technology can actually give us data culture and success with data. I think I'm just under my 15-minute limit. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. I'm Aaron from Elation. And oh yeah, last point I'll make is we have a bunch of customers in the corporate sector, but also a bunch in government. Some of you are on the call, but we're not allowed to say all the names. Centers for Disease Control, I think, is a public reference, but we'd love to work with more of you over time. So thanks so much. Take care.
Great. Thank you so much, Aaron. That was a great presentation. Up next is going to be our first panel for the day. For this, we have Melissa Harris moderating. So Melissa, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure thing. Thank you so much, Alyssa. My name is Melissa Harris, as Alyssa was just talking about, and I'm a senior researcher with GovCIO Median Research. Before we begin, I just want to encourage the audience to submit questions of your own to the Q&A section of the Zoom platform. We'll be going through these questions throughout the panel, so please send them in as you go, and we'd love to get around to them. Please also remember to answer the poll questions as we go throughout the session to ensure that you receive your CPE credits. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists. So with us today is the Department of Commerce National Technical Information Service Chief Data Scientist and ODS Acting Associate Director, Shakib Trabi, Department of Treasury Office of Compliance and Community Affairs Deputy Comptroller for Compliance Risk, Donna Murphy, Defense Logistics Agency AI Strategic Officer rather, Jesse Rollins, and Defense Digital Service, AI, ML, and Cybersecurity Digital Service Expert, Nelson Colon. Thank you all for joining us for this wonderful panel. I'm excited to kick things off. So first, we just want to go around the horn to give you all the chance to introduce yourselves a little bit more here, especially in the context of artificial intelligence. So would each of you like to go into what you do with AI across your agencies, and what some of the responsibilities you hold are, and what's top of mind for you with AI?
Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to stay. I guess I start first. So I work at NTIS, which is a bureau within the US Department of Commerce. And NTIS is very unique in the federal government because we have this unique authority given to us by Congress that empowers us to enter in partnership with the nation's top private sector company, academic institutions, and nonprofits to assist federal agencies address national data-centric challenges and accelerate data-driven solutions to achieve mission outcomes. So we provide a unique pathway and a framework for a federal agency towards innovation and digital transformation through cutting-edge data science and artificial intelligence technologies. One of the area we're going to talk about today is responsible AI. So we know that actually studies have shown that 85% of AI-based projects fail. And we believe that at NTIS, that success comes when leveraging clear and established methodologies for data science and artificial intelligence project management. So our value proposition is well operationalized by our innovation framework, which is strongly grounded in design thinking and in the agile methodology. So we provide this, what we call the joint venture partnership authority, that help us, as I mentioned, leverage leading innovative company to solve complex data challenges. Our efforts are all across the government. We're working currently with in 16 different projects across the government, including at the Department of Labor, at the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Commerce, of course, and the Department of Homeland Security. So I look forward to discuss responsible AI with my colleagues today. Thank you for the opportunity.
Of course. Who would like to go next around the circle here? Or I'll pick on someone. Donna, do you want to go? Or Jesse?
Yeah, sure. I'll go. So Jesse Rollins, I'm the AI strategic officer at the Defense Logistics Agency. My main priority now coming into the job is, laying out what DLA's AI strategy is going to be. Like, that's a giant elephant to eat, right? Because AI isn't one technology, it touches all of our technology stack, and it touches a lot of experts across our organization, pretty much every business line as well. So, the hardest part and the thing that I'm really working on now is, we've got AI at the top, but it's supported by our whole technology stack. So how's our data? How's our infrastructure? Do we have the right expertise in place? And then finally, kind of what we're talking about today, which is near and dear to me, is governance, right? Ethics, risk, fairness, iteration. So glad to be here.
Perfect.
So I'll go next. This is Donna. Hi, good morning, everybody, and thanks for, can you hear me? Okay. So this is Donna Murphy from the OCC. And for those of you who don't know, the OCC is an organization, an agency that charters, supervises, and regulates over 1,000 national banks and federal savings associations. So I come at this from a slightly different perspective than my fellow panelists, because in addition to internal agency use of technology, we're probably even more focused on what the banks are doing that we provide and how they're using technology and how we need to be supervising and monitoring for that. So to tell you a little bit about the OCC, the banks that we supervise range in size from very small community banks to the largest, most globally active banks operating in the United States. So the vast majority of the banks we supervise have less than $1 billion in assets, but together, the banks that we supervise hold over $14.5 trillion in assets, or 70% of all assets of US commercial banks. And artificial intelligence is one of the many technological changes that are reshaping the financial industry by creating new opportunities to provide consumers, businesses, and communities with more access to and options for products and services. AI can provide efficiencies in operations, in backroom office functions, in supporting lending decisions, and in improving a bank's ability to monitor compliance with regulatory requirements. Over the years, the OCC has adapted our supervisory approach to address these technological innovations by banks, and we supervise those banks to ensure that their use of AI does not introduce variables or outcomes that adversely affect the safety and soundness of the operation of those banks or the national banking system. And more specific to this panel, that use of technology doesn't impede fair access to credit or result in unfair treatment of customers. And that's really our focus in terms of bias in AI. We promote responsible innovation in the banking industry to use these technologies, expand access to credit and capital, improve operations, and support full and fair participation in the US financial system. And we expect bank management and each bank's board of directors to understand the impact and associated risks of enabling technologies on their bank's financial performance, on their strategic planning, their risk profile, their traditional banking models, their customers, and a whole number of other aspects. So one of the focal points for the OCC regarding the use of AI is our Office of Innovation, which supports the agency in providing a regulatory and supervisory framework receptive to use of new technology in responsible ways. The OI facilitates the ability of banks to responsibly adopt innovation and associated advanced technology, but it also fosters our internal OCC awareness and use of financial technology, including the AI and other emerging trends. We are focused internally on upgrading our data, enhancing our platforms, enhancing the skills of our examiners. That's a big talent issue for us, and developing processes to build and leverage our experience and expertise in other technology and innovation trends in order to appropriately supervise and monitor for the use of AI and help to protect against unfair outcomes and bias in that use.
Awesome. And I'm sure we'll definitely get around to a lot of those topics you just touched on. But before we do, I'm going to give Nelson a chance to chime in.
Hey, good morning. My name is Nelson Colon. Feel free to call me Nell. My background, for those that are not familiar with how Defense Digital Service works or what it is, we're a group of technologists, usually on an appointment from the private sector. So we come on a 2-year appointment to government and Defense Digital Services, in particular to the Department of Defense, to work on projects related to our fields of expertise in areas that are needed in government. In my case, my background in the private sector, it's building AI for security products and fraud, waste, and abuse. And so we are a team of somewhat first responders for emergencies in need of technology within the Department of Defense. So think about, when COVID, when COVID popped up and we needed to secure the distribution process. We worked with, rapidly standing up all the security measures for that. When we started getting people out of Afghanistan, we worked on how do we actually process how do we match records for people that had worked with us with the records that we have at the Department of Defense rapidly so that we can process their information a lot faster. So that's essentially the type of work that we do related to AI. It's how do we streamline processes in a moment of crisis, and how do we leverage AI in a way that's that it's helpful, but it's also considered. When you think about, for example, when you're processing something as important as a visa, right? We want to make sure that we are taking into consideration that we're being fair in the process, right? Someone, their first language might not be English, but they work and they contributed to our work, and they might have a typo on the form. We don't want to send that form back. We want to make sure that we use AI to detect and use NLP and NLU to detect those typos and the likelihood, and be able to match the record without causing that much trouble to the person. And so they don't have to start the process back. So yeah, I'm excited to be here with you all.
Very excited too, and thank you so much for going into your introductions and giving everyone some context behind your backgrounds. So while the topic of this conversation is about using AI to promote fairness and equity, I think we need to start by talking about how we can ensure that we have trustworthy AI with the right governance, policies, data, and expertise, as all of you were just touching upon. So can you all go into how you're juggling these different aspects of building responsible AI from the get-go, since it's still a very new and emerging technology, and perhaps how recent efforts like executive orders around responsible AI or responsible AI strategies, such as like what has been emerging with the DoD, has been informing your efforts?
Melissa, I guess I start first again. Great question, and that is a very important aspect of the federal government work. So at Commerce, let me focus on Commerce first, is that fairness and equity are really important cornerstone of our vision at Commerce. Our mission is to create the condition for economic growth and opportunity for all communities. So at Commerce, as American Data Agency, we believe that data are critical for the fulfillment of our mission and critical for responsible AI and trustworthy AI. So we have at Commerce demonstrated our data leadership through the implementation of the Commerce Data Strategy that we published early this year. And that data strategy actually provides a roadmap to maximize the positive impact of commerce data and stuff. So the implementation of that strategy is executed through 5 interdependent strategic goals, including the goal to promote appropriate data use and equitable access, and more specifically, promote data ethics across commerce by fostering quality, transparency, accountability, and fairness of data policies and practices throughout the data lifecycle. Currently, actually, I'm sharing a data ethics working group at Commerce, and our goal is to develop the first Commerce data ethics framework. And the objective of the framework is to provide awareness and guidance for ethical, responsible, and equitable data practices throughout the data lifecycle to reflect and achieve Commerce mission and value. As a data scientist, I have to say that data are the raw material of machine learning system and artificial intelligence. So every bias, regardless when it first appears, will affect the rest of the product lifecycle. So it's very essential for any federal government, following, like you mentioned, the executive order about the use of trustworthy AI, as well as to enforce equity and fairness across the government. It's essential for any federal agency to develop best practices and standards for data practices, including strengthening the data quality, the completeness, the inclusiveness, the fairness, and the representativity of the data, as well as following definite guiding principles that relate to fairness, accountability, transparency, reliability, and fitness for purpose. So we believe at Commerce that the earlier the database can be identified, the more effectively the development team and users and the AI system owner can mitigate the issue. So focus again on several principles, but we need to close the gap how to put those principles in practice, and that's our goal in developing the data ethics framework. That stems from work that has been done across the government, from the federal data strategy and the data ethics framework that was developed a couple of years ago, and that we have actually used as a basis to complete this work and expand on it and update it as, of course, this area is evolving very quickly.
Yeah, definitely agree there, especially the aspects between it's easy to think of things in terms of principles and, you know, just bullet points in a framework, but how do you put that in practice? Donna, would you like to add over at the civilian side, since we're sort of piggybacking between here and there?
Yeah, so you know, many of the things that were mentioned are consistent with how the OCC approaches artificial intelligence and other technologies within the OCC in terms of looking to develop strong data frameworks and risk government. But I'm going to actually talk a little bit about what we do in terms of what the banks are doing, because that's really a focus of ours, is ensuring that the use of AI in the financial system, and particularly in the federal banking system, is implemented in a fair and responsible manner. The OCC's mission includes ensuring fair treatment of customers and fair access to the financial system. And so across everything we do, including our supervision of the use of AI, we look for banks, we require banks to have strong governance and risk management frameworks. So we have a lot of rules and guidance that are general in nature that that apply in this situation. And one of the things that we do as new technologies emerge is to determine what additional guidance and information we have to issue for the banks that we supervise. In particular, in this case, we're working on an interagency basis, and the OCC, together with the other federal banking regulators, the Federal Reserve Board, Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the National Credit Union Administration, last year issued a formal request for information and comment on financial institutions' use of artificial intelligence, including machine learning. We received more than 70 very detailed comments in response to that RFI, as it's called. That is really helping to inform our development and sort of modernization of some of our systems as we're supervising banks' use of artificial intelligence. And one of the key foci, that's the right word, of the RFI was, how are banks ensuring that when they're using artificial intelligence to make credit decisions, to determine who gets loans, how are they ensuring that that is not having a discriminatory impact on a prohibited basis, that it's not excluding certain groups of customers, and that it's in fact expanding access, which is their intention. And so we are looking at all those comments to determine how we should be proceeding in terms of monitoring and supervising that work, and what guidance and requirements we should be imposed on the banks in that regard.
Fantastic. And now we could pick the brains of those on the defense side. So Nelson or Jesse, would you like to take your turn?
Sure. Yeah, I think all of that resonates with me. I think another thing that we are also doing, and I'm sure my colleagues would also, agree, it's that in order, AI, at the end of the day, it's a tool, right? And so one thing that we're doing is actually trying to make the teams that are working on these products be equitable and be diverse, so that we have that diversity of opinion when it comes to analyzing the data. And so when we have representation in the room, when we're actually thinking about the problems, so that if bias at the end of the day, it's a problem of low variance, right? And so if we have a diverse group of people bringing, different perspectives, that will help us mitigate some of that. So that's one of the things that we work hard towards, building in our team. It's bringing that diversity, making sure that we have everyone, or most people represented in the room when we're building these technologies, so that we can mitigate some of that human factor when building these products.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, of course, agreeing with everyone else, from the DoD landscape, there's been some big strides over the past couple of years. Last year, I think we had the DoD tenets come out, and the second one is, how do we make AI equitable? What are the direct steps we're going to take to target and minimize bias, right? So those were great from a conceptual point of view, but right, as previously said, how do we get to the practical? I think it was last week, the CDAO of the DoD released the RAI kind of like strategy and implementation plan, which finally gets us into that. How are we practically going to do these things? Model inventories, monitoring plans, feedback systems, ethical and fairness checks, responsible parties, right? Risk mitigations, building that expertise. So the DoD is finally getting to that at the enterprise level of, hey, we're not joking around. Here's how we're going to actually practically implement these things. If you get really at the grassroots level, I heard, trust in AI mentioned. And I find that such a great concept of like, how do we trust AI systems, right? We know how to do this, right? Because we trust our people. What do we do before we trust our people, right? You get a background check, you get a reference check, you have a supervisor, right, who monitors you and does performance appraisals, right? There's internal controls of what you can and can't do. There's system checks, right? And so we just extend that type of same trust framework fundamentally to these AI systems, right? Who's monitoring them? What's their performance like? Have we checked the references? Is this a good model to use just on first principles? Is it unpopular? Is there something wrong with it, right? Doing all these things, the same thing we do with our people, we need to do with our AI models to build that trust. So I always found it funny, like hearing that trust concept. We're going to trust AI. Like, well, we'll trust them as much as we trust our people, which is not very much. Like we do that risk mitigation up front, right? We make sure people are ethical before they come into the government, right? And we need to do the same with our AI models too.
That's such an important aspect. Sometimes we think of AI as sort of like the silver bullet, as we tend to say in this kind of industry, but it's really just something that we use and develop as people. So the people behind it's very important. Before we start digging into how to leverage AI for fairness and equity, getting to the meat of the conversation, I think it's time to pull up one of our poll questions. So Alyssa, would you like to pull up the first one for the session? All right. It doesn't seem very surprising, but it looks like, this is a very important area for most attendees here. So glad to see that. So now that gladly everyone here is sort of on board with the idea of increasing fairness and equity, I think, if we can ideally get to this point where we can sharpen AI and everything we need to tee it up for success, what are some of the best strategies for using AI to increase fairness and equity across federal decision making? I know getting data rights a large piece, the people part's a large piece, but what are your thoughts on how we can use AI to promote equity rather than to continue biases and such?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this one. This is kind of an alternate take. One of the things I love about AI is you're doing modeling and statistics and trying to lay out a system where you necessarily haven't done before or haven't thought to done before. So when you start using AI, you're kind of exposing the weaknesses in your system where you wouldn't think to have looked before. And so if you're doing smart AI, you're doing ethical checks, you can bring forward a lot of problems you may have in your systems just by utilizing AI already, right? A lot of ethical problems aren't nefarious, right? They're a lot more from ignorance. Like we didn't know that this was happening. If we had done a statistical study or an AI study, we would have known it. But when you bring in the technology, you start exposing those weaknesses if you're doing it right, right? And so, we can have the best of intentions when we use these models, but we have to make sure they don't hurt people. And so that's one of the things I love about AI is because you're trying to model your system And it really can expose your bias if you do it right. It can be such a valuable tool to bringing more fairness and more equity to your organization.
And if I can piggyback on what Jesse said and what Don and Nelson also mentioned, yeah, AI is a technology, but let me emphasize a very important point though. Personally, as a technologist, AI is unquestionably the most powerful technology that the world has ever known. So, like Jesse mentioned, it's extremely important actually to make sure that we have the right framework in terms of tenets and in terms of practice, because harm that can be created by technology can be exacerbated through AI. And there is this kind of like urban myth that AI, since it's based on data, it's make evidence-based decisions, which is of course wrong. We know that data is one of the major issues that affect fairness and equity in the models and affect responsible AI. So we have to look at but on the other hand, I want to make sure that we all understand that we should see AI as an opportunity, because we have to look at, when we use responsible AI, we compare it to what our current situation is. We have issues. I'm sorry, Donna can mention that about the loans, etc. We have problems right now about like lack of equity, lack of fairness in several areas, in finance, in employment, and so on and so forth. So we have to look at AI actually, even though it can exacerbate or amplify some of the issues, is also look at it as an opportunity to actually promote and achieve equity and fairness, to make sure that the solution that we develop that are AI-based actually are used as intended and in accordance with our laws, regulation, and values, and for the right purpose. So the question, of course, is how we are going to accomplish that. I think was mentioned from the Department of Defense. Melissa, you mentioned it, the responsible AI report that just came out a few days ago, that started with principles but trying to bridge that gap between principle and practices. And that's what we're trying to do as well as Commerce. We did that ethics framework. We try to make the framework easy to access and not prescriptive, basically just try to raise awareness about these issues. And this is should be an iterative process. This is just the first step. And I think and then I leave to my Nelson and Donna to expand on that. But I think one major aspect is, of course, to develop stronger data culture within the federal government. We need to better understand what data are, how to use them, how to access them, and how to make sure that actually data are the right quality, and then put in place the governance policies that allow us to make sure that we using is fit for purpose and accurate and unbiased. Hopefully we'll reach at some point then. Thank you.
Yeah, so if I can jump in, I think that last point I want to follow up on, because the issue of whether the data you're using, what data you're using and what the biases are that are built into it is a really critical one, and just maybe core to how we can make artificial intelligence, promote fairness as opposed to, continue or exacerbate it. Because and again, I'll go back to my financing as an example. In the finance world, it's well known that, for example, property valuations, decades of discrimination and in terms of where, including by the federal government, actually started by the federal government, in terms of where loans could be made and where loans would be made by banks, have built into property valuations discriminatory elements, right? And so the agencies actually, the OCC and the other federal banking agencies, as well as the Federal Housing Finance Agency and the CFPB, are working and have been working on a rulemaking that's required by the Dodd-Frank Act, which is the 2011 financial reform legislation. They're working on a rulemaking about automated valuation models, which are automated models, some of which use AI, some of which are more traditional models. But one of the important questions there that the agencies are looking at is whether and how we can identify the bias that's built into the underlying data and use the models and ensure that the models don't continue or exacerbate that, and hopefully that they mitigate it and promote fairness. And there's some really interesting work being done on developing AI models that can help to identify the discrimination and bias that's built into all of our existing data. There's still a lot more work to be done there, but that's really just, I think, a critically important area and really a really exciting one in terms of the promise that it has for the future. In order to make sure that happens, though, I wanted to pick up on points that Jesse made in terms of really important and very, very important to. I took away his point as, we do security background checks on our employees. We need to do security background checks on our models, right? And long-standing OCC guidance going back to, we have guidance actually from 1997, from 2011 on model validation that wasn't focused on AI, of course, but is critically important to to ensuring that your models are validated before, during, while you're using them on an ongoing basis in the financial area. But the point that Nell made about making sure the people at the table are bringing diverse viewpoints to how you develop, how you validate those models, how you develop them, how you use them, is, I think, something that hasn't been as focused on. And the current acting comptroller of the currency, Michael Sue, has made that diversity and inclusion kind of approach, both within the OCC and in the banks we supervise, an important issue that he's focused on. So all those points, I think, are critical as we move forward in this area.
Definitely. And then Nell, would you like to take us away with this question?
Yeah, I think, I agree with what my colleagues said. And I think to Jesse's point of, having AI is going to always expose these biases. And so you have to be smart about, how do you put control so that you can see this and detect it and correct it quickly? And for me, that always ties back to the people, because I served for 2 years as a White House Presidential Innovation Fellow at VA, and working on how do we use AI to improve the benefit processing for veterans. And one thing that I really liked about VA was that we had this motto of design with veterans and not for veterans. And because, as a technologist, I might find, the technology aspect, the modeling aspect, very exciting and very, interesting. But the reality is that I'm thinking about it from my perspective. And ultimately, I need to be focusing on how is this affecting the people. And so making sure that we have that feedback, like Jesse said, as soon as we find these problems, can we fix them? Can we spot them quickly? And the way that we spot them quickly is by having those people be part of the conversation.
Definitely. And, each of you touched upon some of the different areas where this impacts your mission work. So I think it would be a good opportunity to talk about, potentially some examples of use cases of where we can really leverage AI capabilities to identify those biases and shortfalls and current practices that we have, or government systems, other areas of work. Donna, I know you mentioned some of the different financial system shortfalls, but do you want to continue mining on that? Or for the other panelists, are there other areas where you see this really holding some potential?
Since I sort of jumped ahead, maybe the others could add some examples, and I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Yeah, I think there's a host of cases. I think kind of the best ones are any cases where human judgment is involved, right? Because the AI that you're trying to build around any process that had any type of human judgment in it is going to be biased, right? Because all of us are biased. And so if you have some processes that have heavy human selection bias, right? HR, finance, contractor selection, bidding, buying, right? Those are ripe cases to have the AI come in and try and map out those systems, build those models, show you the outputs and show you what's causing those outputs. And you can really use those models to kind of expose any biases or unfairness that you have in your organization. I'm all about, ethics and AI, but, what we're really trying to get at is ethics as an organization. The healthier your organization, the healthier the AI.
Yeah, I agree with what Jesse mentioned. I'm someone that think like it's very important, of course, to have tenets and that in place, principles that we want to abide with, and of course to comply with law, regulation, and statutes in place, and some best practices that to bridge the gap, to make it really practical for anyone. Like Neil mentioned, it has to be across the board. It has to be from the leadership. It has to be from the developers. It has to be from the end users, and people are going to be affected by whatever that kind of product has been developed, and really provide like the outcome that it's supposed to have. So opening up, be inclusive is extremely important at different levels. So when you develop those best practices, you need to look at them from different perspectives, from different personas. And that's extremely important. But it's an iterative process because it's a tough process to go through. So we're learning about AI, we're learning about the effect of AI, we're learning about the opportunities that AI provides us with. And so we need to kind of develop kind of framework that help us navigate through all these complex issues. One thing that we need always to do, no matter what the project is of course to have income assessment. So we need to to outcome assessment to assess the potential effect of any data product or AI-based product, and then have across the data life cycle, across the project life cycles, control mechanisms that will allow us to assess and validate whatever decision we make. Human decisions can be also wrong. So it has to be human have to be involved, but we need also to try to develop some objective ways to actually characterize any type of decision that is made through the process. But I'm also one that advocate that one size doesn't fit all. When we develop AI products, they don't have the same effect. So we need to work like NIST has proposed, to work on developing a risk management framework that kind of try to establish a framework for you to adapt to any project that you want to do. You don't want any type of projects that does linear regression to go through a complex process and slow down the advance in technology that we want to accomplish, or to develop solutions that we actually in need of. But as long as we have a general set of principles and practices that are understood by everyone, and avenues like Dan mentioned about anyone transparency, so that anyone can actually at any point, if they see something is wrong, that they have avenues to communicate that and escalate that, and then have some kind of recourse. And so I'm sure don't agree about the recourse part. That's part of the law in finance, right? So I think that's extremely important as well.
Nell, I'd like to turn it over to you again.
I think Jesse and Shakib did a great job. I don't have anything more to add to. I just concur with their thoughts.
Yeah, of course. And Donna, I know you mentioned a few different examples before, but is there anything that's, lingering in your brain as you hear everyone else speaking?
I just think I'm actually learning a lot from listening to my fellow panelists. So I think these are all really important examples, and just really, this is just an area that has so much promise, but but we really have to be very careful in terms of making sure we're looking at our assumptions.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm glad we're all learning here. That's why we get together here. So quick reminder that folks can put questions in the Q&A. We can get to those, but before we do, we have another poll question that we need to pull up. So Alyssa. All right, looks like about half say yes and a good number say they don't know. So hopefully as we continue to massage this knot around AI, we can start to get to the core of that. I see that we have a question over here. It's a little lengthy, but I'd like to get to it since we have about 15 minutes left. AI and related cutting edge technologies are the leading areas where we can expect those with the best technical competencies to take key roles and address the emerging challenges. I'm trying to understand how equity comes into play in this sort of environment. Is the policy to meet a certain number by equity policy, no matter what the outcome would be, by way of potentially losing those billets to more highly technically competent individuals? It's a loaded question, but I think it revolves around, the role of policy there in terms of like measuring, certain outcomes with AI and, what kinds of setbacks it may have. Does anyone have any thoughts on this question?
Maybe I can start quickly. I mean, I think a very important thing that we mentioned that the federal government is mission oriented. So when we try to accomplish our mission, we always try to do it effectively and efficiently and respect our values. So this makes aspect of ethical aspect, like Jesse mentioned, not just in AI, but in every aspect of anything that we do, extremely important. So equity is extremely important. We have an executive order that want us to work harder to accomplish equity because we have equity issues that we want to address, and that relates to every type of activity that we do. I mean, we have problems with the employment. Like now we are trying to be more efficient using AI-based tools, which is extremely important because we want to actually have humans focus on the task that we are supposed to do, not tedious tasks just to read resumes, etc. But if we are providing a machine to do that work for us, to help us basically go through the resumes and then summarize what's in there and help us with our search process, we need to make sure that those machine-based solutions are ethically validated. They're not discriminating. There is no bias in them, etc. So just an example of that. So whatever we do, we of course we want to do it efficiently because we are to be good stewards of taxpayer money. But at the same time, we want actually to be, since we're mission oriented, we want to make the world better and change it for the better. And then we use all the tools in our toolbox, including AI, but in the right way. So that I think is an important point. And that's why equity is extremely important. And I'm happy that that everyone should think about equity as something extremely important in their whatever federal agency they work on or whatever organization they work at. Thank you.
Couldn't agree more. Does anyone else have any thoughts on this? Otherwise, I have about one or two more questions to go before we end, and one more poll question to go with. So Okay. I take that as that we're good to go. So I guess one of the things that we need to think about here is what we do looking forward. As we've sort of touched upon, as we know across the space, we're only scratching the surface with a lot of the governance and technical potential of AI. So where are we going in the future? What kind of data policies, governance strategies, expertise, data, or other aspects do we need to strengthen? And what part do you see yourselves playing in these efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a huge question, right? I'll target it towards fairness and equity and ethics. You know, when it comes to our organization, you know, like I said earlier, I view fairness and equality and ethical violations like they're mostly from ignorance, right? If you look at other professions that have a lot of ethical complications, right? You look at healthcare, you look at finance, you look at contracting, you look at legal, there's requirements for ethical training, and they're usually annually. You know, when I was in finance and accounting, I had a legal requirement every year to get ethical training. And so one of the things I'm trying to push forward, you know, in my organization, and, you know, whenever I have a chance to comment through the DoD is, hey, we need to do the same step here. If you're designing AI systems, if you're building machine learning models, we need you to have an ethical training requirement every year so we can avoid those ignorance problems. You know, I think that's going to clear up a lot of the ethical issues that we have because most people just don't know that they're ethical issues. So let's copy what all these other, you know, fields that have ethical problems do. Just add manual training so we at least get that base to cover a lot of these issues before they even start.
So true. So true. Who would like to go next?
So this is Donna, I'll go. And I think that as an agency, you know, OCC's mission is focused on bank supervision and regulation and chartering. And we've really focused till now as an agency on sort of how we can improve, how we can use AI and other technologies to improve our systems for doing that. But one of the things that you know I love about this conversation is the ways that other agencies are using this to look not only at their sort of operation, not only sort of at their mission activities, but also at their operational activities, and to, you know, the discussion about identifying bias, using AI to identify biases that are existing in our sort of operational activities is something that I think, you know, I'd like to focus on at least. And I mean, as an agency, we're already focused on sort of one of the real issues that we have is sort of making sure that we can use our data, our supervision data, to whether it's you know, it's in data governance and data quality is sufficient to actually, you know, use AI and different new technologies in productive and effective and appropriate ways, as well as, you know, upgrading our systems and developing those new models. But I think that we can use it more broadly, and I think that's hopefully in the future.
Yeah, I think for me, if you couldn't tell by this point, I think the part that I'm most passionate about, and the part that I'm going to continue focusing on, it's representation and diversity in the groups that we build, that we create to build this technology. I've been in the academic environment on this work. I've been in the private sector, and I've been now in government. And throughout my career, I've always found that when we bring people from all different types of, you know, backgrounds, we actually build better products. We actually build better solutions. And it's just something that I am very passionate about, and I will continue to make sure that we're bringing, not just in terms of, you know, our ethnic backgrounds, our life experiences, but professional. My teams in academia, when we were doing, I worked in research on gerrymandering. How do we use data to improve, to build better, more fair maps? And our teams were very diverse, from people from policy, people from data science, people from math, people from social sciences. And and our best work came from having different opinions and different perspectives in the same room. And so that's something that I carry with me in all of these discussions about how do we move forward.
Yeah, I love what Ned said, because I think that's extremely important. We have to look at it from a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach. And like Ned said, diversity is not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do, especially in this context. The other thing I will add is that, again, when AI is malfunctioning, it's sometimes just exposing or amplifying problems that already exist. So we need to make sure that there is historical data, there is historical processes that have actually created inequity, created unfairness, etc. So focus on the data. So we definitely haven't done it the right way. So let's focus on how to collect the data, how to make it more representative, how to have control mechanism to make sure that the data is validated, that doesn't create or enhance any unfair outcome or etc. And that include what Neil mentioned, diversity of opinions when you try to focus on what type of data you're looking for. How can you look at bias in data, and that all type of bias, statistical bias, human bias, systemic bias, etc. So the more multidisciplinary the team is and involved and engaged, the more communication we have both ways, the more control we have, the more, that's how we're going to be addressing the issue eventually. And we all going to be benefit out of this. That's the important thing. As a country, as a nation, as people, all these are going to go to the right direction. Actually, leveraging AI in the right way is going to be extremely important for us as a country, as we move forward.
Fantastic. I think we've learned a lot here about, the people behind the AI, building the right teams behind it. After all, if we're trying to get to fairness and equity, I feel like all hands sort of need to be on deck for this. So I really appreciate, all of your comments here about how we need to look toward the future. I want to give one last opportunity for people to submit questions into the Q&A, but otherwise I would like to turn to the final poll question. I guess this will be a look into how people are considering, how our conversation went. I feel like this is like the apex of the conversation here. All right, well, some don't know, but most think that, AI can play a role. So, there's still a long way to go with the AI conversation, with the technology, with getting the right foundation in place between the people and the data and the infrastructure, and the governance and leadership. And that includes all of you here today. We're going to be wrapping up the panel a little bit early, but it looks like everything is teed up for the next conversation that's about to happen. So I just wanted to thank all of you here today for sharing your thoughts and your leadership, and also wanted to thank the audience for your engagement with your polls and the one question we had. So in the meantime, Alyssa, I'd like to turn the program back to you and over to the next panel.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, panelists. And to you, Melissa, that was a great panel full of so much insight. Up next is going to be the second panel for today. For this panel, we have Jory Heckman moderating. So Jory, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Alyssa, and thanks everyone for joining me for the second panel of the day here. I think you're all pretty well familiar with this by now, but please keep those questions coming in. I want to make sure we have time to get to them throughout the conversation here. Other than that, we're going to have some more poll questions coming through during the conversation. So make sure you answer those so that you're able to get your CPE credits for this. Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our fantastic lineup of panelists here. We have Scott Beliveau, the acting Chief Data Officer for the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. We have Oliver Wise, the CDO at the Commerce Department. We have Brian Lorenz, the Chief Data Officer for the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. Tom Sasala, the Chief Data Officer for the Department of the Navy. And we have Nick Saki, the Principal Technologist for Pure Storage. Everyone, thanks for joining me. We have so much to get into here, but I think a good place to get started, by all means, give yourself an opportunity to introduce yourself and your agency a little more fully, but I'll just couch the introduction in a pretty broad question here. What's the AI or the automation use case at your agency that excites you the most? Scott, we'll start with you first.
Oh, so thank you. Thank you. I was wondering if I was going to be first. I was stuck as number one. Yep. Scott Beliveau. Actually, I'm from the USPTO. USPTO is an agency, sometimes referred to as America's Innovation Agency. We look at things, basically everything around you under the sun probably has either a patent or a trademark. All the good things that help make our lives nice and better. In terms of use cases with respect to things going on in the agency or just in general, I think use cases are exciting. I think I usually turn to like a quote from, I think it was Jim McKelvey. He said, really, the focus of the entrepreneur is always on the horizon beyond the wall. And that's really, to that end for use cases, I'm really most excited about those that are looking at spurning jobs, creating economic opportunity, really empowering innovators, entrepreneurs to grow and to help really American workers and business complete. To that end, and consistent with the USPTO's mission of promoting the useful arts and sciences, we do a lot of work, a lot of use cases along those lines.
All right, great. Well, we'll move it on up, higher up in the Commerce Department. We'll hear from Oliver. What are the use cases that excite you the most?
Yeah, thanks, Joy, and thanks for the whole group here for organizing this. So I'm Oliver Wise. I'm the Chief Data Officer at the Department of Commerce. Really happy to have here be on this panel with Scott, who's also part of the Department of Commerce. USPTO is a bureau within Commerce, and see some old friends here as well, including Tom Sasala. When I came to Commerce just about 90 days ago, I'm new in my position and was excited to see that there was already an inventory of AI use cases underway. And I thought those would just, maybe there'd be a dozen, but really when you look at like what is happening at Commerce, department-wide and all of its 13 bureaus, there is a ton of innovation happening, and there's really a robust set of use cases. It's really more in the order of like 100 or so use cases. So I think we've reached a scale where you can really develop some typologies about those use cases. I'll talk about 3 of them real quick that excite me, and I'll leave it to Scott to talk about some other types of use cases. But I think the ones that most excite me is everything around image detection. The largest bureau within Commerce is NOAA, which is not just about oceans and not just about atmospheres. It's really about, it collects environmental data from everything from the bottom of the sea floor to the surface of the sun. And it is also the biggest source of data within Commerce in terms of volume, and also in terms of cost, is the satellite system that NOAA operates. However, that satellite system will be eclipsed within the next 3 to 5 years by drones collecting imagery data. Those are drones that are attached to autonomous sailboats, really, which will be used to map the seafloor and get a much better understanding of our oceans. So commerce, and especially NOAA, just has an enormous, mind-blowing amount of imagery data already, and that hockey stick growth in imagery data is only expected to accelerate. So AI is really not just a nice to have, but a need to have in order to make sense of that enormous amount of imagery data. So I'm especially excited about those use cases. You already see some very practical use cases coming up there. There's one to allow recreational beachgoers, and I'm sure there's a lot of people headed to the beach this weekend, to alert them of where there's riptides, which are very hard to detect to the untrained human eye, especially if you're at the eye level of the beach. And if you don't have lifeguards, it's very helpful to have some early warning of when and where those riptides are. So there's some research underway to train a deep learning model to detect where there are riptides, and then to alert beachgoers that there is one in the area. So riptides claim lives fairly regularly, and I think that's a really good use case that will save lives and protect the American public as they enjoy America's shores.
All right, great. Thanks for that, Oliver. And for all this talk about the sea, let's naturally turn it on over to the Navy. Tom, let's hear a little bit more about the use cases over at the Department of the Navy that are front of mind for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was actually thinking about this earlier today, and I was like, what's my favorite use case? And I jokingly say that it's HAL 9000 from Space Odyssey, but we're not quite there yet when it comes to artificial intelligence, at least not by my measure or mark. But we have a number of different things happening with AI these days. And so some of the most compelling actually are related to what we're doing on the surface and subsurface activities, which is really around autonomous vehicles and our ability to create platforms that operate on their own in the open ocean. And so there's a lot of different things we're doing, both in terms of just sensor data that does support some of the work, maybe from NOAA, that's gathering weather, it's gathering wave information, it's gathering current information, and allow these platforms to kind of, and I'm going to put this in air quotes, right, float around the ocean, because they're not really floating around. They are truly actively navigating around the ocean using telemetry, not only from their own internal sensors, but from GPS and satellites and a variety of other things. And then using a similar sort of basic technology there to engage in other sort of sensing techniques that, we need to do for the Department of the Navy in terms of, checking up on shipping containers, on commercial pathways, that kind of stuff, as well as, keeping an eye on maybe some of our adversaries, for example. And so that autonomous work is really progressing at a dramatic scale. It's something that we weren't doing a whole lot of earnest investment in not so long in the distant past, and it's really accelerating today. And so using those lessons learned from the research development, productionizing that or operationalizing that AI is just a ridiculously compelling use case for us right now. Now, in terms of the broader sort of, I would say the data ecosphere that I play most in, there's a lot of other sort of AI stuff that we're doing from a departmental level in terms of image recognition, which, Oliver mentioned a little bit. In this case, this is more in terms of maybe trying to identify friend or foe, some sort of target identification, automatic human or the computer assisted artificial intelligence techniques for the humans to help them in targeting to make better targeting decisions. And then on the kind of what I would say on the operation, or I should say on the mission side, the business side, which is really the use of predictive algorithms and helping us with better supply chain management, better platform availability, better better execution of our budgetary authorities. We get a lot of money, obviously, from the Department of Defense and from Congress. And so making sure that we spend that money appropriately, making sure that it is obligated and committed and obligated at an appropriate rate. And then when we do have money that's left over, rather than reverting those funds to Treasury, we're now using advanced predictive techniques to say, hey, when is this money going to expire? And then looking into the root cause of maybe why the money wasn't spent, and then trying to make some investment decisions if we're allowed to, reappropriate that money to something else. So lots of various different things that we're working on right now. And so I would say there's just really big, large areas that we're trying to figure out the best uses for artificial intelligence. And a lot of them are coming to fruition today. And so I'm excited by that.
All right, a lot of irons in the fire. Thanks for that, Tom. And Brian, I'll turn it on over to you. What's the PRAC's position on automation and artificial intelligence and everything that it entails?
Yeah, thanks, Ray. The PRAC. So the PRAC is a new entity, right? It was created under the CARES Act to deal with the fraud associated with pandemic spending. So we oversee about $5 trillion that was pushed out the door. I think most people are familiar with the SBA PPP EIDL programs, the Department of Labor Unemployment Insurance programs, and within all the state workforce agency, but it all adds up to about $5 trillion worth of spending. And the fraud associated with those programs, to say the least, has been brazen, pervasive, shameful. It's pretty dramatic how much fraud there actually is with those programs. And so how do you oversee $5 trillion? You have to get into the data, right? And so we've ingested a very large number of data sets that are government data sets, but also a number of commercial data sets, open source and whatnot. And then we've started to build models. And so the use cases are essentially fall into three categories, right? There's the fraudster is using someone else's identity or a synthetic identity. That's one of the use cases. And there's all kinds of analytics that we're building around that use case, right? Then you have the fraudster is misrepresenting their eligibility. So they are who they say they are, but they're pretending that they're eligible for something that they're not. And that's actually been pretty dramatic. And there are so many different tells out there if you bother to use public data to sort of uncover that misrepresentation. And then lastly, and this may be the hardest to detect, is the person is who they say they were. Sorry, I shouldn't say who they say they were. Is who they say they are. They are eligible, but they did not use the funding or the programs, the loans, the benefits the way they were intended to be used. And so for each of those kinds of use cases, there are probably hundreds of sub-use cases, thousands of flags, and putting it all together through machine learning, and then ultimately be able to apply some kind of artificial intelligence to it. I think to some extent, the distinction is that we're doing a lot of pay and chase of this money. Unfortunately, the money went out the door, and now we're trying to figure out if we can how to hold people accountable, law enforcement, or maybe get them to pay it back or whatnot. But it's pay and chase. But I think one of the reasons we do that is upfront, we don't have the artificial intelligence to really make a very, very quick upfront assessment that yea, verily, the person is who they say they are eligible for it, and we can make that determination really fast. And maybe the future is to use artificial intelligence to get to the point where we can stop these payments before they go out the door. And I think that's a focus.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Brian. And Nick, I'll turn it on over to you for that industry perspective on things. Where do you see the federal enterprise going when it comes to automation and AI?
Everywhere. So across every endeavor of human activity and human cognition, every agency is employing or exploring employing artificial intelligence to improve their operations. And this is really driven by the enormous explosion in data. There's just far more things that we can know than there are people to actually work through it to help make smart, relevant, timely, accurate, and predictive decisions. So AI augmentation of human capacity has been proven utterly essential and foundational to modern governance in the 21st century across literally every area of endeavor. If there's a cabinet department covering some aspect of American life, then they're exploring artificial intelligence, as you've already heard, from the national security space, autonomous transportation, space exploration, aeronautics, fraud detection, financial services. It's everywhere, and it's going to continue to refine, improve, and be even more pervasive. So we'll get to a point where we're going to be automating fundamental decisions and executive authority to supplement two artificial intelligence entities to supplement our own human capability.
All right. Thanks for that, Nick. And I'll throw this out to whoever wants to take the first crack at it here. One of the big underlying themes that I'm getting from this is that automation is, for many agencies, a force multiplier for the human workforce. There's just not enough eyes to look over all the data that's out there, for example. And so in terms of that force multiplication proposition here, how is that a valuable tool in the toolbox for your agencies?
I'm happy to start, Jerry, if you would like.
Sure.
I'll get things started. I mean, I always think of artificial intelligence in its most simplest form as, commercial things that I use, right? Like Netflix, where it tells me, oh, you like action thrillers, therefore you're going to like these next set of action thrillers, right? The application in the world that I work in, right, and in fraud detection is if I have 100 some flags operating out there, and there is a certain number of combination of flags that rarely result in a false negative or false positive, and so I zero in on an entity. Why don't I look for all the entities that hit the exact same flags and then carry it out to all of them? So it's, if you like this criminal, you're really gonna probably like this criminal. And so that's probably the most simplest form of AI that I see, and it's a force multiplier, obviously, because the big thing that we worry about, other than the false negative, of course, is too many leads that result in false positives.
Yeah, and I'd just like to pull that thread a little bit too, because I from my perspective and what we're trying to do across the DoD as well as the Department of the Navy is there's various levels of automation, some of which are really computer augmented artificial intelligence support to decision making, right? And then there's what I would call the relatively, and I don't want to make this sound pejorative, but the mundane automation of the things that we can allow a computer to do that a human no longer needs to do, that doesn't necessarily require training or an extensive amount of training and good training sets, right? That's something that we're trying to get after as well, because what we're seeing is that does free up the human beings then to focus more on that sort of what we call battle management aids or computer-aided decision making, right? That allows us to spend more time, more cognitive time, right? Approaching problem sets in terms of allowing computers to assist us, as well as what we're seeing is a lot of push from the forces, from the operational side, is the trustworthiness of the training data and the recommendations made by our computers, whether they're fully augmented in terms of artificial intelligence, marginally augmented in terms of some sort of machine learning techniques or whatever. But there's also just the and I'll just give you an example. We have to go in every so often and turn off accounts of people that haven't been using their accounts, right? That's a process that used to be a human being that would run a report every day and say these 15 people haven't logged in 30 days, go in and disable their accounts or lock their accounts or whatever. There is no reason that a human being needs to do that. None whatsoever, right? And you can take that and extend that to a lot of other sort of use cases, right? We were just talking the other day about the use of artificial intelligence and helping us select candidates through something like USA Jobs, right? Do we really need a human resources specialist to go in and say, hey, let me look at a resume, let me look at their responses, do they match? That's something a computer could potentially do. Now, that's also something we've been talking about. We want that to be slightly more intelligent, because what we're seeing is, and this was part of, I think, the previous panel as well, we are seeing a little bit of bias insofar as the people that are responding to the questions just rate themselves 5s across the board, and they pay, keyword bingo with your resume to make sure it matches what the questions were, and then the computer spits out, hey, this is a good candidate, whether they're a good candidate or not. So that's something that we've been discussing, and then the ethics around there and potential biases that we might introduce inadvertently in that selection process. And so there's a lot of things that we've been kind of talking again on the non-operational side, but also that kind of force generating side from a Department of Navy perspective that really helps us drive our mission at the end of the day, and get the quality forces that we need into the pipeline. So.
All right, great. And Scott, I was noticing some head nods from you. Anything you'd like to add to that question?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, going kind of the early introduction, world of intellectual property, world of, all the cool, neat inventions and things around us, there's always more. And, I don't think anyone really would argue that, technology generally becomes more complicated over time and off, and I think as Nick was talking, it's being used everywhere and it's almost unbalanced for different missions. Well, that often equates to increasing filing or effort being put, or filings within the USPTO. On average, we get about 5% more work every year. And, if you think about it, it's like, well, do we hire and increase our workforce exponentially by 5% plus every year? And the answer is no. We can't really do that in a sustainable manner. So it sort of is what Nick was saying, the nature of the job as a result of that requires that patent examiners look for it's like the needle in the haystack. Everything that's been done before, they need to know whether this thing is new against it. So it's almost like because it's everywhere and everything that they have to look at a thousand haystacks for those particular needles. That's where we look at the construct of human resource or human capital augmentation with AI to help filter through and go through those particular signals in order to make our workforce more efficient.
Okay, well, let's go to the first poll question. Alyssa, if you can prompt that for everyone. In your opinion, how important is strengthening customer service to furthering artificial intelligence within the federal government? All right. Well, it looks like we are seeing people agree strongly that it is important, which I think is a good segue to my next question here. In terms of moving the needle on customer experience, how do you see AI and automation as a useful way to get there? Oliver, Scott, I think from a Commerce Department perspective on things, you guys have a lot of customers. Let's hear that side of things.
Yeah, I mean, the most common use case for AI, according to the inventory that was underway when I came in, is chatbots. So just being able to answer the 80% of citizen questions quickly and efficiently, so that you can really get the humans to answer the 20%. So I think that's a very common use case and really a fairly mature use case at this point. And then the other so that's one element of customer experience, that actual like customer and government interface. But I think also just part of customer experience thinking more generally is just better, more efficient, more timely services that meet people where they are. And I think AI is critical to that effort, and really, I think will be increasingly expected of residents. So I think Scott's example of the use of natural language processing to speed up and make more efficient the patent processing process is a great example of that. And I think any interaction of the citizen to government that's like that, like applying for something like a license or permission to do something that otherwise would require a human being to go through a whole lot of records. If AI can assist in that process and help automate it, not necessarily replace, but can assist in that process, I think you're going to have a better, faster customer experience with their government.
Okay, great. And Scott, from the USPTO side of things, is there anything you'd like to add?
Sure. Yeah, and I think it was kind of touching on what Oliver was saying. Our mission is to basically grant and timely execute, high quality patents and trademarks. And it comes down from a customer service perspective. The faster that we're able to do that in a manner that makes those predictable, reliable decisions, the better we're all served, as American people. So see, to that end, we have sort of a, maybe it's a slightly different look at how we're using AI in sort of two broader categories in this realm, or as it is. And that's, we use AI really to bring promising techniques into the building with novel applications. For example, we talked about, a little bit about patent search, classification. We've built tools for the public to help them file applications to kind of lower the barriers for small independent inventors. And we've done policy landscaping and kind of pushing research. But the other part of this sort of dialogue or interface, or how we're getting more into sort of the customer side, is we're also contributing information or data that is advancing that research. So it's kind of both hands kind of working on two sides of the fence discussion, wherein we're, doing these data challenges. We just wrapped up one, I think a couple of weeks ago, with working with Google Kaggle. It was over 2,000 participants, 88 countries. We're providing data sources that are, training huge models to create that kind of that next thing.
All right. And Tom, do you want to jump in on this question as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of times in the DoD, we get, I would say, fixated on operational support, right? So when we talk about artificial intelligence, it's really how are we supporting the warfighters in terms of these battle management aids? How are we doing automation in terms of sensing and using that against a peer and near peer adversaries, right? But I do think, pulling that thread that Oliver and started here, is that customer service side of the DoD is something that I don't think gets enough attention. And what I mean by that is, as an employee of the Department of Defense, right, when I need a question answered, it's really hard to find the answer about just a myriad of topics, right? I was, occasionally we get these emails saying, hey, if you're interested in retirement, go to this seminar. And so I was like, well, what are the terms and conditions for retirement, right? So do I need to go to the seminar or not? And I thought it would be a relatively easy question to get answered, just going to the HR website and saying, hey, how old do I need to be? How many years of service? Yada, yada, yada. Not an easy question to find the answer to. And the best, most credible information, ironically, I found at OPM, which is broadly applies to all federal employees on the civilian side, right? And so I just think that there is some utility here for us to step back and look at our customer service for our internal customers, for the people that work there, not just the constituency, right? Obviously, if we're supporting our customers in this case, which is mostly our military as well as the citizens of the United States, right? There's some interactions there, but I would say, you know, don't forget the opportunity to help your employees out and make a better workplace and maybe potentially increase morale because you're not spending half of your day trying to figure out your time card or something like that. That's what I'll offer.
All right, thanks for that, Tom. And Nick, let's hear from you on that.
Sure.
The perspective here of customer experience, customer service.
So Scott said something that I thought was incredibly trenchant, and that technology has a tendency to become more complex over time. And I work on the other side of this equation. What technology does becomes tremendously more complex over time. We've come a long way from picking up a rock as our first tool to the digital world in which we live today, but it actually is an unbroken chain of innovation from that point to today. Our challenge in industry is taking the incredibly complex and making it incredibly accessible. So technology should become more capable over time, but it also should become more usable. Now, the era of AI and the explosion of data that we were talking about, the breadth of things that we're trying to leverage data to do has increased in variety in ways that nobody could have ever conceived. Well, very few people ever conceived of, but the practical application today is extraordinary. So the challenge from the industry perspective is, how do we make this incredibly powerful and complex technology usable as efficiently as possible? How do we make it so that you're not spending a lot of time trying to invent the wheel, you're enjoying the time driving, getting to where you want to go, getting to your destination? So that's what we've seen a lot of is over the course of the past 10 to 15 years is the evolution of systems, capabilities, and tool sets that enable us to actually work on the problem as opposed to building the tooling necessary to work on the problem. Rather than having to wrestle your infrastructure and your data into submission, letting the systems take advantage of capabilities that exist today so that we can ask questions and create tools that allow us to get to answers, to augment our capability or enhance our understanding of what we can leverage from our data. So creating that sort of service infrastructure to enable that data leverage is essential to uncomplicating data services for the artificial intelligence era.
All right, thanks for that, Nick. I think it's time for our second poll question. Alyssa, if you can prompt that. What is the biggest barrier to AI adoption that your agency is facing? We'll give everyone a second to answer that. A very reassuring all of the above is the majority answer here. So on that note, let's get into it here. We've spoken so much about the opportunities of AI, but we should definitely explore the flip side of things, right? The challenges of AI and how do you prevent the misuse of this technology, as exciting as it is?
Recording in progress. I'll start with that, Jory, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you need, coupled with your AI strategy, you really need a data ethics strategy as well. I want to give credit to Shakib Sharabi, who's was on the previous panel, and I think might still be here in the room, from NTIS. He was the chair of our data ethics working group in our Commerce Data Governance Board. And that group's work is still in draft form, but I think will be released within the next few months. But I think it gives a really helpful and practical and pragmatic articulation of how to think through ethical issues as you're deploying AI and other data-related initiatives. So I think you have to, I think it's very important to do that. I think also there's a culture in government, but really in all organizations, because this is true in the private sector too, of like the policy people handle all the tough normative questions, and it's the technical people who just take direction from the policy folks and put the policy into action. And frankly, I don't think that paradigm really works when it comes to AI, because there's so many ethical issues that come in the technical implementation of what's ever coming down from the policymakers. So I think we have to change that culture within government and really have technical people at the table in policy decisions, and also policy people at the table on technical decisions.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Oliver. And Brian, over on the prac side of things, what are the concerns about the misuse of AI, and what steps is the prac doing to mitigate those concerns?
Yeah, so the misuse, I mean, obviously you don't want bias in these in the flags that we create, and the way that the machine learning can start to create a system where you go after certain certain groups. And so that happens to be probably the biggest challenge that we have in AI that always comes up, is make sure you cannot introduce bias into the algorithms. But you asked also the question about the challenges with AI, and the challenge that I think we face the most is, and I'll give you an example. Right, in 2019, SBA had 700 some complaints to its hotline. Not a whole lot, pretty manageable from a human standpoint, right? In 2020, it had over 200,000 complaints on the hotline, or submissions to the hotline. That went way past what they had humans that could review. And those humans, the people that are submitting them, they've obviously are outraged about something. They've observed something. They feel it's really important to report it to law enforcement. And you got to get back to them. So how do you get through 200,000 of them? Well, artificial intelligence comes to mind, and most of those hotline complaints are in the form of narrative. I mean, there's some boxes to be checked, but largely it's a narrative. So you have to use natural language processing. You have to do concept pairs and concept extractions and things like that. And the machine learning part of it is really complicated. And to a large extent, the way that we ended up doing it was human reviews to teach the machine, as opposed to the machine side that would have led to really artificial intelligence. But the problem is an artificial intelligence problem. At the end of the day, we are trying to use, the only way you get through 200,000 some hotline complaints is you get a machine to think like a human being and to parse through it. And we got through it, but the amount that the technology, the procurement process, the amount of data scientists that we are able to get our hands on to do these kinds of analyses, that's probably been the biggest challenge that we've had.
Okay, and Tom, over at the Navy, how are you guys dealing with this challenge side of things to AI and automation?
Yeah, so it's actually quite challenging from a variety of different fronts, right? So if we go all the way back kind of to the fundamentals, we have our fundamental issue of the data and the trustworthiness of the data, ignoring any sort of computer processing, right? And then the data has to become cleaned and curated. We have to know that the data is authoritative or maybe ready for use for some sort of decision-making purpose, right? And then there has to be some algorithm that is written, designed, and trained to provide some sort of recommendation in terms of, things I'm going to, again, air quotes, simple things like navigation, position, and timing, right? Those outcomes are relatively straightforward. There's you're either going in the right direction or you're not, right? And so training those algorithms kind of result in an outcome that is observable, right? Whereas if it's something that is a little bit more amorphous, that is a recommendation, like select this target over this target, or don't shoot this thing, instead shoot that thing. That's something that we need to trust. Not only the algorithm, we need to trust the resultant recommendation from, but we have to have some insight into the training information, have to send insight into the deployment mechanisms, right? Do we trust how the algorithm got there? Do we trust how the system that is using it, is it operating from, you know, a traditional 19 or Orange Book sort of terminology called a trusted computing base, right? Is anyone manipulated either the training data or the algorithm since it's been trained? Has anyone, you know, manipulated the system in any way? So there's the ethical side of should we use AI for this, which is problematic, but there's a much more pragmatic sort of approach when you're thinking about this from a defensive system perspective, right? And this is something from a DoD that a lot of the agencies and a lot of the commercial companies don't operate in a contested environment, an environment where you have someone who is intentionally trying to manipulate your systems and your services and your ability to operate and perform your primary job function, right? We're seeing this more and more in the private sector with the ransomware attacks and this kind of stuff, right? And so it's reached the boardroom, as it were, in terms of what, you know, kind of the environment that we've been operating in essentially since the inception of the DoD. But now the question is how far do we want to take this kind of trustworthy computing environment? Because there's downsides to it, right? It makes things harder to use. It makes things harder to deploy. It introduces this, what I would call this culture of compliancy, which is what we're in now, rather than a true culture of security and trustworthiness, right? Which is where we kind of want to get to. If you look at like what Aaron Weiss, who's our CIO, talks about this cyber ready, right? And so I know that's a completely different riff than maybe what you know, Oliver and Brian were talking about, but it's just a broader concept to really consider about. There's all these different facets, and certainly the choice of ethical use of an AI is a step, but there's a lot of other things after that choice is made that actually you need to factor in to say, is this recommendation from our artificial intelligence really the answer that we want to choose to accept or not, right? So I'll just leave it at that.
All right, well, Oliver, let's go back to you.
Yeah, I just want to, these conversations about ethics and AIs tend to center around mitigating the downside risks and especially the potential for bias in AI. And those are real, and we should definitely focus on them. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that the ethical imperatives of AI, and government inefficiency is unethical when there are other alternatives, and it often has inequitable impacts. So let's go back to Scott's example of, you know, making the patent licensing, the patent process faster and more efficient. Like if you're a minority-owned business with not a whole lot of runway, that sluggish process to get your patent, to get your business off the ground, has profound impacts on you, has real economic costs, and is much more likely to affect a relatively poorly or a business with less liquidity and less resources than a very wealthy business. So if you want to promote an equitable playing field in at least the business culture, the business environment, but I think this goes really in all sorts of spaces, government's got to do its job efficiently and effectively, and adopt the best in breed technologies in order to help them get there. So certainly we need to mitigate the downside risk, but I think we need to keep in mind that there's real ethical imperative to realize the benefits of AI when it's out there.
Okay, well, we're believe it or not, drawing to an end on this conversation, or at least the time that we have to do it. So we'll go to the final poll question here, but everyone generate your final closing thoughts here as we wait for those poll answers to come in here. Big question here. Do you have big data at your agency? Yes, no, or I don't know. Yes is the unequivocal answer, I think, here at 63%. That's good. That's reassuring, because I don't think the problem has ever been not enough data. It's just how you organize and what you do with it. That being said, Brian, let's go to you for the first crack at a lightning round closer here. What is the one or two points that you'd like to make here that our audience takes away from this conversation?
I don't have any great depth of thought on it. I mean, yeah, we need to use artificial intelligence. It's going to allow us to cover a lot more ground faster. We need to be conscious of bias. We need to make it auditable. As a matter of fact, as an IG community, I think that being able to audit those algorithms, make sure that there isn't bias in the algorithms, will become increasingly important to us. But other than that, it's just a matter of getting through a lot more ground much more quickly. I think we're probably at the beginning of the learning curve. I don't think we're getting to sentient AI anytime soon, and in the work that I do, certainly. But yeah, those are sort of some thoughts to leave you all with.
All right, and Tom, we'll take it over to you. What are your closing thoughts?
Yeah, so my number one closing thought around artificial intelligence is don't forget about the data. So you have to set the foundation. There's a lot of pragmatic things you need to do with your infrastructure, with your data, before you can even consider using artificial intelligence. And so I always like to foot stomp that if you are investing in artificial intelligence and you're not investing in things like cleaning and curating and cataloging and inventorying your data and knowing what your data landscape looks like, then you are fundamentally doing it wrong, right? So the investments in artificial intelligence have a large ROI, but without setting that foundation, you're gonna basically not be effectively using your investments. So number one recommendation is always take a look at your data inventory, take a look at your data infrastructure, make sure it's ready for AI, and then you can start having these more existential conversations about should or must we use AI and for what purposes.
Okay, and Nick, we'll take it to you next. What are your closing thoughts?
I'm gonna tie off Tom's comments that infrastructure for creating AI capacity and leveraging the data at scale is tremendously different than the legacy compute infrastructures that we've developed over the course of many years. AI just works with data at a degree of parallelism, speed, and scale that really requires a dedicated purpose-built type of infrastructure. Those tools are adaptations of existing technology, the integration of those tools to create the capacity to be agile, to readily adapt to new data types, to new questions, to new models, and to new algorithms are becoming more and more available. We don't have to build them ourselves. They can be leveraged as a service. They can be leveraged through contract providers. They can be acquired directly. There's no substitute, though, for great data and people who know how to leverage it. All of these things, the people, the processes, and the technology, have to work together as a purpose-built, coherent organism to get the results that the government and we, the people of the United States, need to get the most out of this new era of compute capability.
All right, Scott, over to you.
Sure, and like I said, piggybacking Nick, you know, AI isn't magic. I don't think anyone, you know, on the panel is going to say it is. But you know, when you're looking at IT or AI, really need to kind of start looking at it from your agency's mission and what is the sort of enabling goal that needs to be tied to that. So always ask yourself, you know, if you're starting something, what's the purpose or reason for your organization? Who do you serve? What's a crucial slice of that organization of achieving that mission? And then finally, you know, I think we used to talk about, well, if you have everybody needs a data strategy. Well, you're gonna with AI, it's coming. You're gonna need a strategy, and I think in doing so, you really want to sit down and reimagine your current business processes from the perspective of an AI enabled or an AI driven or AI informed organization that really is looking at and retransforming, re-engineering those processes to really, in a way that's augmentation of your human capital, as Nick was saying, because it is coming. It's going to get more complicated. So, be bold and reimagine.
Be bold and reimagine. Very good. And Oliver, you're going to get the final word here. What would you like to leave the audience with?
Thanks, Jory. The first one is AI is here. It's not a technology of the future. It's a technology of the present. We're right within it. And then the other thing I think that we really need to focus on as in the public sector in particular is explainability and reproducibility of our models. I don't think we do quite a good enough job of that. And I think that's important both for ethical reasons and to ensure that our models are auditable and that they're transparent and that they're explainable. But I think it's also important for scalability. With a lot of the use cases we discussed today are not bespoke to one particular type of business flow. They can really be broadly applied. Like the image detection one in particular is broadly applicable to a number of domains. So I think it's important that we document these use cases well, that we explain them, make the models reproducible so that they're more trustworthy, that we're hedging our ethical bets, and also that we can scale those models to different domains.
All right. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. Everyone, please give the panel a virtual round of applause here for doing such a great job. And Alyssa, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, panelists. That was a great discussion. Up next, we're going to have our last panel of the day. For this panel, ATARC is teamed up with the USDA Food and Nutrition Service to bring you a panel focused on utilizing advanced analytics and potential of AI. For this panel, we have Tom Temin moderating. So Tom, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, if I can find my own window here, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. I can't see myself, but a lot of us seem to be logged in as Dr. Tamika Owens, so the real one is visible now in the screen. And welcome, everybody. It's good to be with you. We just heard a good dissertation, academically speaking, you might say, of what is going on with this big data, the application of advanced tools to it, artificial intelligence, and so forth. And let me just hit that button. There I am. Okay, terrific. And we have now going to bring this around to a practical application for a very large federal program, the Agriculture Department's Food and Nutrition Service. The SNAP program is about $122 billion plus or minus, depending on the economic circumstances of the nation program, but it's a big one. And we're going to hear exactly how they're positioning their data and how they're applying some of these tools to their data to better improve access, equity, and program integrity. Really fascinating story. And as I said, we have a cast of thousands from Food and Nutrition Service. Actually, it's just 5. And with us today is the Assistant Administrator, Tamika Owens. Good morning, Tamika. I guess good afternoon, I should say. Chris Rottler is the Assistant Chief Data Officer. Paul Nieto is Deputy Chief Operating Officer. Melissa Abelev is the Assistant Deputy Administrator for Policy and Support. And Christine Daffin is Senior Technical Advisor. Again, all from the Food and Nutrition Service. And I guess maybe Dr. Tamika Owens, will start with you on the idea of, just tell us where the Food and Nutrition Service lives within the USDA hierarchy, its chief mission, and more importantly, how you're positioning yourself to pilot and scale some of these data projects that we've been hearing about today.
Sure. Thanks, Tom, for having us. So the Food and Nutrition Service, as you highlighted, SNAP is one of our major programs, but we are largely responsible for the nation's nutrition safety net. And that not only includes SNAP, but also our National School Lunch Program, School Breakfast Program, and WIC, along with several others. So there's a total of 15 programs, but many during the pandemic, we've also launched the pandemic EBT. So our mission grows as the nation's needs grow. But essentially, we are responsible for the nation's nutritional safety net. So that is a big portion of our mission. We're relatively small in the context of the ginormous USDA, but we do represent about 70% of USDA's annual budget. So we're a small agency, but we are mighty in what we're responsible for. And we've taken great strides to kind of make sure that we are considering equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility as part of our mission. I would say that it's always been part of our mission and what we do, given what we're charged with in terms of the nutrition safety net. But we have definitely elevated that as part of the discussion and the work that we are taking on both this year and moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Chris, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, sure. So at least from the data perspective, so in the past 2 years, FNS has built out our central analytics team to support and enable the offices and teams already doing data analytics at FNS, whether that's through making available the tools and infrastructure that USDA as a whole and FNS have invested in, or simply collaborating with teams to support them in answering key business questions and developing decision support tools to do that, whether that's an automated dashboard or something else. My team is also focused on laying the foundation at the enterprise level so that folks here can begin to spearhead advanced analytic approaches themselves, whether it's to answer operational or programmatic questions. And to that point, a lot of our focus is on enablement and the workforce upskilling. But stepping back in terms of the infrastructure itself, USDA and FNS have invested in a pretty robust data infrastructure to support analytics across the agency and beyond FNS. The suite is called EDAPT, or the Enterprise Data Analytics Platform and Toolset. And FNS is really pioneering its use. To date, we've launched our data lake, a data mart, as well as a number of data pipelines from our various source systems that allow us to do things like automate things like dashboards, and also make data accessible to our analysts when that's appropriate. And at the same time, we're also tackling issues related to governance and stewardship, and centralizing certain processes where it's appropriate in partnership with key stakeholders and offices at FNS, whether that's our IT office or ops or whoever it might be. On the enablement side of things, we've launched a series of upskilling programs to help our analysts and teams be able to really begin to formulate testable business questions, but also getting into the nitty-gritty of open source statistical programming. For example, we developed a data science training pilot we launched last year with a really small cohort of analysts at FNS. The pilot was really successful, and it really added a lot of value to our participants. So we launched the program second year just recently, and this year other chief data officers at USDA's other mission areas asked if they could participate. And so we agreed, and we now have over 130 people from across USDA participating in the program. But yeah, these are just a few of the areas where we're trying to enable the talent we already have to do this work, using the new tools that we have available, and help position FNS and USDA as a whole become more data-driven. I know I'm talking a lot, but the last thing I wanted to touch on is how we're doing this all through the lens of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. This is, as Dr. Owens mentioned, really important for us. And we're not taking it for granted, nor do I think DEIA and data analytics are mutually exclusive. Personally, I think the technology piece and the upskilling piece of data analytics are really the easy part. Making sure our approach to AI and machine learning is grounded in DEIA is really tough, because I think a lot of the issues that perpetuate things like inequality are incredibly insidious and sometimes institutional and embedded in the data itself. So as we're thinking of employing these approaches, we as an organization really have to have a first principles mindset. It's about having a diverse group of people thinking through these problems and ensuring we're cognizant of what is actually producing the data being used. If we have the data in the first place, and for instance, are the institutional structures and programs themselves that generate the data used built upon hidden inequality or bias? These are the type of questions we need to ask throughout the data lifecycle, because at the end of the day, data in the models that we're generating are dumb, right? They may be super accurate at prediction and classification, but what they're predicting, if what they're predicting is just perpetuates issues of inequality, or what have you, that's a major problem. And we as a government entity need to be really careful, because the policies that we develop and the decisions we make literally affect millions of people's lives in this country. The stakes are just too high to get it wrong.
Yeah, we'll come back to a lot of those questions. I think Melissa wanted to weigh in here also.
Hi, yeah, so I lead the research office at FNS, and so we have a cohort of about 40 or so master's and PhD level scientists who generate a lot of the data that we're talking about today. At any given time, we have about 110 different evaluation studies of those 15 programs, because we're looking really critically at the use of taxpayer funds, and if we are addressing food insecurity, which is the research term for hunger, but are we doing that effectively? Are we actually achieving those goals that we're looking at? And so for any of those programs, including SNAP and the other 14 programs that Tamika alluded to, looking at very critically, how do we collect data? What data should we be collecting? Are we collecting it in a way that is going to achieve the goals that we're looking at? As well as, are we making that data available to the public? And so all of our research then gets posted up to the website. Our data gets posted to both, as Chris mentioned, the EDAPT, which is the USDA data lake portal, as well as there's also the Ag Library, part of USDA, also has a data portal for us to put data up there so that other researchers can be engaging with our data, using the data that we're generating across all of these studies, in addition to the admin data that we routinely collect from the states. And so then we utilize that, as I said, to look at impacts of our programs, outcomes of our programs, as well as just the operations of our programs. And we are looking at questions of equity and so forth, although in a later question I know you have, we'll talk about what some of the limitations of the data that we have are when we are looking at equity in our programs.
But just a quick follow-up. When you imagine these programs or visualize them, you have applicants, citizens out there that need some form of government assistance. And therefore, there's the data that they submit. Then you've got a whole layer of intermediaries between the agriculture department and those recipients. These are state agencies, I guess maybe in some cases, municipal or county agencies at different levels, tribal agencies, and so on. And then you've got all of the financial data. And then there's all the data from some of the delivery systems that are not governmental. That is, you have retailers, food suppliers, and so forth. It's a pretty complicated mix when you start pulling it apart. And so maybe give us a sense of what types of data are germane here, considering all of the players that contribute data just by their activities related to those programs.
For me, or?
Sure.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. I would say all of the above, right? We have administrative data that we collect routinely from the states that goes into what's called the National Data Bank. So we pull that, we can get national estimates, depending on the variable, we can get state level estimates of that. But it's pretty limited, right? One of the questions we get often is, well, what do SNAP participants buy with their benefits? We don't actually have that data. We don't know the answer to that question, right? And so What we do have is we know how much folks are spending of their benefits, and we know the timing of when they're spending. So that's a separate data set that we can look at, that is SNAP data that comes in. So we do have those standard sets based on data that we just routinely collect. There's a lot of questions though that we can't answer through those. And so then we do primary data collection. And so then that usually comes to my shop, and then we'll do survey data collection. We'll do interviews with participants. We'll do qualitative and quantitative data collection, sometimes through huge surveys. And so as you said, we'll survey the states or sometimes the school districts. If it's the National School Lunch Program, we have a big data collection that's looking at, okay, we have federal requirements, but what does that look like on the local level? How is it actually being implemented? So every 10 years, we launch a very large data collection called the School Nutrition Meal Cost Study, and it looks at what foods are kids being served, and how much does that cost for a school district to actually implement. So we have kind of a mix of admin data collection as well as primary data collection, depending on the research question we're trying to answer at any given time.
Yeah, so that shows that there's a complexity to the data types in the sense that some is self-reported by surveys. That's very different from money thrown off, say, by numbers of recipients or numbers of households, data that is objective versus self-reported. That must make an interesting mix for the researchers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But I don't want to discount self-reported data too much, though, in that we do, some of it is also looking at what's the participant experience. A key thing that we want to make sure is that the folks who are utilizing these programs, that it's really serving their needs and that it's kind of meeting them where they are. So we do customer service type surveys as well, and looking at what, for instance, is a WIC participant's experience on the ground when they walk into a clinic. And so we have a routine study that we do once a decade, but because of the survey sample size, as you can imagine, but it does ask questions like that of WIC participants. And so there's quite a variety of things. Sure. But as Tamika mentioned, the budget of these programs up front, we want to make sure that we're expending those tax dollars that have been entrusted to us as efficiently and effectively as possible.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. And Christine, if your dog would like to be in the picture, that's quite all right with us. We're happy to have dogs here. Bring your dog to Zoom Day, I guess you might call it. But then I want to throw the next question. I think Paul Nieto, the Deputy Chief Operating Officer, can maybe answer this, followed by some of the others. But let's get right to that central idea of ensuring equitable distribution. And how are you using some of these advanced methodologies of data analysis to ensure that? And maybe begin with a definition of what is equitable distribution. I guess I'll offer one and you can critique it and refine it for me. And that is that everyone who is eligible has equal access to that benefit.
Yes, Tom, you're absolutely right. And for my part, I think I'll give an example of something that Dr. Owens had hinted on when we opened up. And then again, I think Chris had indicated, that equity is embedded in the fabric of your organization. So at the beginning of last year, the administration had issued a couple of executive orders to address those issues with equity, specifically to advance racial equity and support to underserved communities. So obviously that affects our programs. And then again, in June of last year, they issued another executive order addressing the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility of the federal workforce. So we took those two calls to action. Obviously, those executive orders drove federal government to support these executive orders. To get at that, what we did was we introduced an approach of examining an internal focus. Obviously, that influences a lot of things, including the delivery of those programs to the American public. But just to give an example of what we did here at the Food Nutrition Service, we took that information and developed a plan to get a quantitative and qualitative look at how we are performing operationally within the Food Nutrition Service. We did that through a number of approaches, including focus groups. We examined 5 years of data based on our workforce. Together, we developed an environmental scan of how we operationalize our mission, how we're conducting business. And what we ended up with was that scan produced a number of opportunities that FNS can now move forward. As Dr. Owens has indicated, we started this year, but this is certainly something that we will advance forward for many years to come. And the overall goal is, of course, to embed those qualities and practices into the operation, starting with our workforce. And like I said, that then generates the outward influence into how we are providing these services, as Melissa had alluded to, the 14 programs that we do provide to the American public. But like I said, that approach definitely opened our eyes to a lot of opportunities. What we look forward to in the future is obviously putting implementation into some of those opportunities. And then we're going to need to circle back again and using the data to obviously examine the performance and how those things are working. So we can't just stop at putting those things in place. We have to examine and look at how we're doing, make adjustments to ensure that we are supporting those executive orders, and obviously getting to our goal of embedding these qualities into how we're doing business day to day.
Right. You can't just have a snapshot of SNAP. You need a moving picture over time to really make sure that you're moving toward the goal there. Christine, comment?
Oh, hi. Yeah, so, I'm within the program, I'm within SNAP, and we work really closely with the CAT team. And a few years ago, we stood up something called the SNAP Mission Data Platform. So that sits within EDAPT. And one of the things that we're doing a lot of lately is looking at our data really from an equity lens. We're just starting to dip our toes into the advanced data analytics world. We've done a lot of the groundwork to prepare for taking those next steps, but we're also trying to be really strategic and really thoughtful about the approach we take with our data and any analytics we do. So just over 2 years ago, we stood up the Mission Data Platform, and really what we needed was this centralized location to pull in all of our data, to be able to look at what we've got, to visualize that data, to perform analysis, and start to identify trends or gaps in the data that we have. And we started bringing in our data, and we started working with our program staff, and we continued to note the lessons learned, refine that process, refine the data, and try and fill in some of those gaps, or at least understand the limitations of the data that we have. And really, so from our perspective, and when you think ahead to AI or machine learning, equitable distribution of services really cannot happen without the integration of data knowledge with policy knowledge. These two really cannot exist in silos. And so pairing our data experts with our policy experts in SNAP has ensured that we're really asking the right questions and that we're able to draw accurate conclusions. So our approach has been to hold stakeholder sessions or subject matter expert sessions and bringing together all the right people to build the knowledge about what the data means, refine our analysis. Our process has been intentionally iterative to allow for this continuous feedback loop. And within SNAP, there's a lot of potential for AI and machine learning, but I think you've heard it several times here that if you don't get it right from the ground up, it's as good, garbage in, garbage out. I'm sure several people have said that here today.
Sure.
So,
And I was going to ask Tamika, it sounds like then there is the requirement to kind of triangulate in on the answer to the question, because, for example, if there is racial equity or racial fairness in the distribution of these benefits, SNAP and all the others, the 15 of them, because to my knowledge, there is no federal application form that asks a racial question, correct?
Right. Well, and that's optional, right? On most things within FNS, but across the federal government, people reporting how they identify is definitely something that's optional at this point. But to Christine's point about, making sure that you have this data in a central location so that you can perform that dedicated analysis, looking for trends, but also figure out visualizations of that data to help drive the decision-making is critical. And while SNAP is doing it, that's an example of how we're doing it within one of our program areas. We're also doing that with our administrative data looking at it internally. So it's not just an external focus. We're also looking at that internally, as Paul alluded to. And we've done that through a number of different mechanisms, but we've created a barrier analysis dashboard that looks at the kind of the landscape of our staff and what is it that we have, who do we have on board doing this work, providing these services, and where are there opportunities for the agency to increase our diversity, but also the accessibility. We want to make sure that we are adhering to what the administration has set forward in terms of DEIA, but also there's a diversity of experience there, and that experience only strengthens us as an agency to help us meet our mission. In addition, it's not just, how do we get people through the door and have a diverse workforce in general. We also use data to look at people that are leaving and what are the demographics of individuals that are leaving our agency and why are they choosing to leave. And that helps inform how we move forward as an agency. And most recently, we've started to dabble in sentiment data and how do we transform understanding how our internal customers are receiving services and what are their sentiments around that. And Chris and the central analytics team has been very helpful in helping to look at that from a quantitative and qualitative perspective to help inform how we operate internally as an agency.
All right, Chris, tell us more.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, and we see you a lot better now that you've kind of switched positions there in the lighting.
Yeah, the power of the iPhone, I guess. There are a number of areas where we're using data analytics both operationally and programmatically to support our mission, our staff, and also the people we ultimately serve. From my perspective, we've really laid the groundwork, at least in terms of the technology. We have the capability to utilize artificial intelligence and machine learning. The question we're really tackling now is, should we and when? For instance, where and when does it make sense to employ these methods, when we have that data available, and how do we do it in a responsible manner, and thinking through a lot of the guidance that is provided by the administration itself, like through the executive order, I believe the number is 1396, which essentially focuses on promoting the use of trustworthy AI. And I know I sound really cautious, but I am really excited for FNS and USDA as a whole. We are positioned to begin to utilize machine learning more in a responsible way. And we have piloted its use in a very controlled and specific use case that Tamika and others probably have mentioned. For example, we've employed natural language processing in an internal customer service tool we developed, which it's pretty much used to gauge how our service organizations are doing here at FNS. There's a lot of open text fields in that survey tool, so we use NLP to sort through all that and measure things like sentiment, as Tamika just mentioned. And we're also currently working with one of our regional offices, along with one of our state partners, to develop an interactive nutrition map dashboard. And as part of that project, we've employed clustering, specifically K-means clustering, to help end users identify comparable counties in terms of specific metrics that matter to them, like food insecurity and access. This is neat because it allows the state and county partners to really use it to find comparable counties, not just in their state and region, but in the country as a whole, which can help make connections in terms of lessons learned and successful approaches to things like outreach or educational initiatives. So we're taking baby steps, but I'm excited to see how we can really take advantage of the investments we made in the infrastructure.
Okay, excellent. And by the way, I see there are still close to 80 people here. I don't see any questions in the question submission. So if you've got questions, I don't know how you get them in there, but you can figure it out, because we had questions in the last session and I will see them and we'll make sure that the panel can answer them. So please feel free to join in that sense. And let's move on to the question of the challenges next. We've talked about some of the data challenges, maybe discuss some of the tools challenges that are here, because I think in the earlier session, one of the speakers said, this is not a future technology, this is a technology now. And of course, every technology seems great until you see the next generation, but we have what we have to work with now. So maybe comment on some of the challenges you need to overcome to scale these types of projects so that they become regular operational parts of guiding the program. Melissa, you want to try that one?
Sure. Sorry, make sure I get myself off of mute here. Yeah, so the challenges with the data, and as you've said, and I think Tamika commented as well, that we don't require that folks fill out information unless it's kind of legislatively required for an application. We don't add additional things, and so we're regularly asked, what is the racial makeup of your programs? And that's a challenge for us because we don't collect that data. Historically, we've had visual identification. And so the caseworker who's helping someone fill out an application can look at someone and then say what they think they are. But obviously that's very, very problematic. And we actually published a rule as of yesterday that says that that's not a way to do it, that caseworkers can't do that. And so we don't know if the data that we have, how accurate it is, and we have about 20% missing values in that data set. And so when we're looking at the data, we know that there are problems with that. There's biases in that data. And so, being able to take that data and then do really good analyses to say, are we reaching people equally? Are we reaching people equitably? We don't have good answers for that question. Some of what we've done is match data sets. And so we'll combine our admin data with either census data or Department of Education Common Core data, where they have some of that. We'll combine those. We can get some of that so that we can then do sub-analyses where we're looking at, for instance, in the WIC program, breastfeeding rates by racial breakdown, so that we can kind of see what's the overall number and then what's the number and the trends over time by different racial groups. But as I said, one of the key challenges is we don't really have good data there because it's not required. And so there's a lot of missing data. And so when we're trying to really utilize that, there's a lot of limitations to that.
Sure. And Christine, maybe is it possible to, and this may not be directly an equity question, but maybe an access question, to look at, in some fields, they look at abandoned applications, or they look at that very specific data at the interface between the applicant and the system, and therefore the agency. And if people are quitting the application or coming back repeated times, there's lots of metrics on users. Can that be employed in some way to ensure that somehow there's something you could maybe improve about it and automatically increase participation and equity in that sense?
So I don't know that we have that data specifically. I think sometimes there are a lot of challenges to getting data, especially when, like you said earlier, there's several layers. We have our state data, we have different data sets that come from multiple different sources. So, one of the big things that we've been attempting to do, especially within the program, is look at those various data sets. We mentioned census, we have quality control data, a robust quality control system, and pairing all of those data sets together to see where those gaps are and then what we can do about filling in those gaps. But, we have to be really careful about what we're placing on the states, what we're asking from our states, their rules to what we can do in that area. So really thinking strategically about what the gaps are, what the gaps mean, and the areas in which we can maybe increase data collection in the future. Or, I always say, what does the data show us and what doesn't it show us, right? And what data is good and we need more of? What data maybe we need less of? Maybe we're asking questions we don't need to, and we can pivot and change some of those. So, we're always thinking about that, but it's challenging.
Yeah, and Chris, I wanted to ask you that, and I think Paul can probably weigh in on this question also, and that is the questions themselves often precede what it is you do with data, because that's where chief and assistant chief data officers come in, is, what are the questions, and then figure out what raw material you need to put in an application to get that answer. So maybe discuss some of the questions that come up here, especially in that DEI area.
Yeah.
Oh, Chris, I'll go ahead and jump in. Yeah, Tom, I think when we looked at some of the federal employee viewpoint survey data, depends on what those questions are and how they're perceived by the populations that's answering them creates somewhat of a challenge because, what that question means to me may not be what it means to Chris. So we're going to answer it in two different ways. So, realizing that there is variance in the answers to questions and the data that we are collecting, we take that into account as well, in developing solutions or approaches based on that data.
And Chris?
Yeah, so I think the other panelists really hit the nail on the head. The only thing I would add, and as I mentioned earlier, I think there are a few things we need to keep in mind when scaling this type of stuff and identifying those questions as you asked, Tom. The first, as I mentioned earlier, we really do need to have that first principles mindset. The analysis and the development of models and tools is really the tip of the iceberg. It's obviously all about the data and understanding the context and digging into the structures that generate the data. Like I said, inequality is insidious and not always easy to uncover in data and the questions that we ask, right? And the onus is on us to ensure that the fuel that powers the models we develop first do no harm and second do not exacerbate inequality. The second, I think it's really imperative to have a diverse team working through these problems. That's really a prerequisite, I would say, because if your team all looks the same or from the same generation or what have you, you're missing out on a really important perspectives that could uncover some important insights and those questions, right? And finally, whatever is developed needs to be understandable and clear. So really no black boxes. If your team has a hard time communicating what a neural network is and how it works to end users, then that's the wrong approach, regardless of the accuracy, right? Like the solutions on top of that need to be managed and administered by humans, which seems pretty simple, right? But it also has to be done so frequently. Like I said before, the data and the models at the end of the day are all dumb. They do what we tell them to do. So it's important to have that touch, the human touch as well. But yeah, so those are general guidelines, I'd say. Beyond that, I think if people on this call are in the space in government, I highly recommend reviewing that executive order. There's some guidance there in terms of how to approach this type of stuff. Yeah, so thanks.
All right. And Tamika, I wanted to get back to that question on employees and your own staff. I mean, you need diversity, and that cuts across a lot of axes, including diversity of thinking, but you have to retain the staff. And Paul mentioned the federal employee viewpoint survey results every year. And so you've got that broad brush look at the agency, and you can so do you find that in trying to help manage the agency from a managerial executive standpoint, that some of the new data tools are helping to inform the kinds of meetings you have and the kinds of discussions you have and the kinds of possible adjustments you might need to make relative to what was available a few years ago?
No, absolutely, Tom. I think one of the things that we've talked about a number of times as part of the executive leadership team is that data is a piece of the story. It is not the entire story. And to the extent that we look at it from that approach and we encourage that diversity of perspective and opinion and understanding what the data tells us, but also what it doesn't and where there may be gaps. Christine and Chris and Melissa have touched on this a bit, that the data is what it is. It's all about our interpretation of it, but we also have to go into it with a critical eye towards examination, but also inquiry. What are we missing here? What it's telling us one thing, but what are we not seeing based on this data, not only programmatically, but with our staff? And that's why I relied a lot on Chris and the team to kind of say, we have these administrative databases, whether it's the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey or other HR type data about our employees. What are we missing, and how do we put these pieces of data together to create a web and better understand where there are gaps, but also where there are opportunities for us to improve and continue to meet the need. And that exit survey piece is also very important because that gives us a glimpse into why people may not feel that they're getting what they need and looking at those demographics becomes another piece of the puzzle. It's not the whole puzzle, but it's definitely part of the journey. And I don't know where the destination will lead us, but we have to be committed to continuing to be on that journey and being on that journey together.
And let me ask you this, because we heard about policy, policy knowledge and data knowledge. To what extent do you feel that, and Paul can jump in here too, or really anybody, but the idea of, I mean, policy ultimately is set by Congress for what are the parameters of the benefits programs, but yet we live in an age where federal managers are supposed to live and plan and make decisions by data. So can good data analysis help you on a couple of fronts? Maybe recommendations to Congress that here's how the program could be more equitable, more efficient, whatever the case might be. Everybody likes both of those things. And also in your own appropriations justification for that staff and that infrastructure you need to deliver on that 122 billion, or I guess if you add them all up, it's probably close to 200 billion in school lunches. Although I guess ketchup is no longer a vegetable.
No, absolutely. And I think Christine and Melissa have hit on this extensively. And within each of our program areas, as as budget proposals are developed, we rely pretty heavily on the data to drive that. But beyond just us proposing things, there's extensive outreach from Congress to Melissa and her team, as well as Christine and their team, to kind of provide some assistance in how they are understanding what our needs are and the implications of what Congress may want the programs to do. And so that's a very critical piece of that, and they provide extensive technical assistance in that area.
Yeah, and Paul, I imagine you must have the sense, and all of the team there have the sense, that in some ways this constituency is maybe the least able to advocate for itself, say, relative to those on Social Security, which includes the wealthiest people in the country, as well as the poorest people in the country. But when it comes to these programs, you really need to do more proactive development with respect to what the needs and the program parameters ought to be.
Right, Tom. And yeah, that's why I said, and I think it starts with a foundation, obviously, with that inward look at how we operationalize our mission. It starts with, I think we've all kind of hit on this, it starts with that inward look and that fabric. Chris hinted on this, what you do in-house will find its way out to the public to address those very issues that you're hitting on there, Tom.
All right. Well, I want to thank you all for a fascinating discussion. These are interesting programs from a program standpoint. They're big, they're important, and they matter a lot to the American people. So we thank you for all the work you're doing, and keep up the good work. We'll check in next year and see how things have been going. That brings us to the top of the hour. So let me turn it back to Alyssa.
Great. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. So thank you again to Elation and Pure Storage for partnering with us today on this summit, and also to our amazing panelists and keynote. Before you head out, there is one more poll question. Just so if you have answered your polls throughout the day, just so that we can send them to right to your email, your CPE credits. And we would just like to thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you at our next event, which happens to be tomorrow. So have a great rest of your day.